While history remembers the loud battles won on battlefields and parliamentary floors, because the actual blueprint of the 19th century was quietly redrawn within the silent, velvet-draped confines of the afternoon tea room. Here, a seemingly innocent daily pause was weaponized into a sophisticated system of female diplomacy, strict class filtering, and global geopolitical display. It is the story of how an empire's vast colonial reach was distilled into a single quiet room, dictated entirely by the stroke of a silver spoon. Hey friend, before we step through these heavy doors together, let the noise of the modern world gently drift away. Adjust your pillow to find that perfect, supportive pocket of comfort. Pull your blanket a little closer around your shoulders, letting its familiar warmth anchor you right here. Breathe out slowly, allowing the tension in your mind to soften completely. Everything outside this moment can wait. Tonight, we are travelling back to London in November of 1880. A steady cold rain is tapping against the glass panes of a grand townhouse in Belgravia, but inside, the air is perfectly still, resting in the deep warmth of a fading hearth. This journey into the past is a work of creative historical narrative, constructed solely for entertainment, relaxation, and educational purposes. While every layer of our exploration is firmly rooted in verified archives, certain scenes and atmospheres have been textually reimagined to provide an immersive, peaceful auditory experience for your night. It is a calm space built to let you listen closely to the whispers of an era that still shapes our quietest habits. To truly understand the profound authority of this afternoon ritual, one must first look at the strict architectural segregation of the Victorian estate. As the late afternoon light turned to a dull, lazy amber across the city, a deliberate separation occurred within the household. The massive dark mahogany doors of the formal dining room remained closed, sealing away the traditional domain of the men. In that masculine space, the atmosphere was dense and heavy, saturated with the overwhelming aromas of burning cigars, rich port wine, and the echo of aggressive political and economic debates. It was a room structurally built for friction and direct confrontation. Seeking an alternative, women practiced a systematic ritual known as the withdrawal, leaving the noise behind to move gracefully into the withdrawing room, seen a title later shortened by society to the drawing room. This room was engineered from its very foundations to be an acoustic and thermal sanctuary against the harsh, rapidly industrializing world outside. Massive velvet drapes dyed in deep shades of emerald and claret cascaded from the high ceilings to the floorboards, acting as a barrier that swallowed the damp London fog and muffled the chaotic sounds of the streets. Underfoot, a thick hand-woven wool carpet absorbed the sound of every footstep, reducing human movement to a silent, ghostly glide. The furniture was intentionally low to the ground and heavily cushioned, creating an environment of relaxed but highly observant calm. In this silent, soft space, women established an independent geographic territory. By converting this physical environment into a sanctuary of privacy, they turned a simple physical retreat into a sophisticated laboratory of social organization, where the unspoken rules of Hattie-Gerhat society were written, tested, and strictly enforced. Bang 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 pop high, bang bang bang. To understand the true catalyst behind this elegant afternoon gathering, one must examine a profound structural crisis that quietly disrupted the 19th century, a crisis not of politics or warfare, but of time itself. For generations, human life had been dictated by the predictable ancient rhythms of the sun. When the daylight faded, the day naturally drew to a close, and the evening meal was consumed early in the afternoon. But the arrival of the Industrial Revolution brought a powerful new technology into the grand townhouses of London: the widespread introduction of gas lighting and highly refined oil lamps. This advancement fundamentally altered the human relationship with darkness. Suddenly, the night could be banished at the turn of a brass valve, allowing the aristocratic elite to extend their social, political, and business hours far past the boundaries of dusk. This technological shift had an unexpected and immediate biological consequence. It slowly pushed the hour of the formal evening meal further and further back into the night. Where dinner had once been served at 5 o'clock, it was systematically delayed to 7, then 8, and eventually as late as 9 o'clock in the evening. This artificial extension of the day created a vast hollow expanse of time, a long empty vacuum between the light luncheon, taken at morph noon, and the elaborate, late-night dinner affair. Every single day, at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a quiet crisis of human anatomy began to unfold across the wealthy districts of London. The human body, still fundamentally wired to natural circadian rhythms, experienced a sudden heavy drop in energy. It was a period of physical exhaustion and mental fog that high society tried desperately to mask. In a culture that demanded flawless composure and absolute self-control, admitting to physical fatigue or hunger was a severe social vulnerability. The aristocratic class found themselves trapped in a chronological void. They were forced to endure the dimming cold hours of the late winter afternoons, ver capite hat, empty stomachs and fading spirits, waiting for a dinner that was still hours away. This daily vacuum of time and physical energy became the exact catalyst for the afternoon tea ritual. It was not originally conceived as a grand display of wealth, but rather as a highly practical, strategic solution to a modern industrial problem. The introduction of gaslighting had not just illuminated the ceilings, it had stretched the elastic limits of the human workday and social calendar until they began to fracture. In the drawing rooms of the elite, this 4 o'clock slump was felt with a heavy, magnifying intensity. The flickering amber glow of the early gas jets revealed a room of quiet suffering, where the pressure to remain perfectly poised collided with the undeniable reality of human biology. It was from this hidden friction between artificial time and natural human endurance that a new social institution would quietly emerge. Bang bang bang, part bar bang bang bang. The resolution to this hidden chronological crisis was initiated by a single, highly influential individual who occupied the highest tiers of the Victorian social hierarchy, Anna Maria Russell, the Duchess of Bedford. In the early 1840s, while residing at the grand estate of Belvoir Castle, the Duchess found herself increasingly exhausted by the mandatory, maybe agonizingly long wait between the light noon luncheon and the late evening dinner. The physical sensation of hunger, accompanied by a heavy lethargy, struck her precisely at 4 o'clock every single afternoon. Rather than submissively enduring this daily discomfort as traditional social etiquette required, she decided to execute a quiet, private rebellion within the absolute sanctuary of her own personal quarters. She began to instruct her domestic servants to secretly bypass the rigid, centralized kitchen schedules of the mansion and bring a tray containing a single pot of tea, a few slices of bread, and light butter cakes directly to her dressing room. This act was entirely unconventional for the era, as meals were strictly collective, institutional affairs heavily governed by the patriarchal master of the house. By consuming food in isolation during an unprescribed hour, the Duchess was effectively carving out a micro-pocket of bodily autonomy. She discovered that this simple, restorative pause not only remedied her physical fatigue, but also provided a profound sense of mental clarity. Before this private sanctuary evolved into a widespread cultural phenomenon, it remained a carefully guarded secret among her immediate circle. If you find comfort in uncovering these hidden, quiet currents of human history with us, you might consider subscribing to Whispers of Centuries, sharing this peaceful space with those who seek rest, or simply returning to our library of stories each night ensures that these timeless whispers continue to guide you into a deep, restorative sleep. Word of the Duchess' comfortable afternoon routine slowly spread among her closest female acquaintances, who were all secretly suffering from the exact same exhausting daily void. She began inviting a select few to join her in her private dressing room, converting her individual act of physical relief into a shared exclusive experience. The invitation was remarkably simple and intimate, completely stripped of the heavy, masculine formalities that dictated the rest of the aristocratic calendar. In these early private gatherings, women found a rare opportunity to speak free, unobserved by the patriarchs or the formal political apparatus of the estate. What began as a desperate physiological necessity for a hungry duchess quickly transformed into an exclusive, highly desirable social gathering. As she returned to London and brought this habit with her, the drawing rooms of the capital began to adapt to this new rhythm. The 4 o'clock hour was no longer a period of silent physical endurance, but a calculated pivot point where a new form of social currency was about to be minted. Bang 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 part born, bang bang bang. To appreciate the profound relief found within the Duchess's newly established sanctuary, one must look closely at the oppressive environment it was actively replacing, the rigid, heavily gendered domain of the formal Victorian dining room. This space was the undisputed theatre of masculine dominance, an architectural fortress designed to project heavy, unyielding power. After the main courses of a heavy meal were cleared away, a mandatory social ritual occurred, the formal separation of the sexes. At a precise signal from the master of the house, the women were expected to rise silently and vacate the room, leaving the men entirely to themselves. The moment the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind the departing women, the atmosphere of the dining room shifted completely, dropping its polished veneer of mixed company politeness to reveal a raw, confrontational energy. The air in this closed room quickly became thick, stagnant, and physically punishing. Large, heavy crystal decanters of port wine, a deeply fortified and highly alcoholic vintage imported from the Douro Valley, were systematically circulated around the long, grease-stained oak table. The movement of the wine followed a strict, unyielding law of etiquette. It was always passed to the left, moving clockwise from hand to hand, an endless rotation that fueled increasingly loud, aggressive rhetoric. Accompanying the heavy alcohol was the immediate ignition of thick cigars, filling the room with a choking, dense cloud of blue-black smoke that clung to the dark walnut panelling, the heavy velvet drapes, and the wool clothing of the men. The smell was overwhelming, a suffocating mixture of stale tobacco, spilled spirits, and the lingering fats of roasted meats. For hours, the men would remain trapped in this self-inflicted haze, their voices rising in pitch and intensity as they debated colonial expansions, domestic trade policies, and parliamentary elections. It was a space designed tightly for friction, where dominance was asserted through verbal endurance to political posturing and the heavy pounding of glasses against the wood. From the walls, heavy oil portraits of patriarchal ancestors looked down, their dark frames reinforcing a generational lineage of unchallenged male authority. The physical toll of this environment was immense. The heat from the gas chandeliers caused the stagnant smoke to hover like a low ceiling, irritating the eyes and constricting the lungs. For the women of the household, this post-dinner isolation was not merely an exclusion from conversation. It was a physical and psychological exile. They were cast out from the core decisions of the estate and the empire, expected to wait in the distance while the men consumed toxic stimulants and negotiated the future of the realm. The dining room was an environment of sensory overload and chemical aggression, a place where the physical comfort of the human body was sacrificed for the maintenance of patriarchal power structures. It was this suffocating, smoke-choked reality that drove the sudden, desperate necessity for a separate geographic sphere. The drawing room, by contrast, was waiting to be claimed, but until the afternoon tea ritual provided a concrete structure, women lacked a formalized, daily anchor to counter the overwhelming weight of the dining room tyranny. This stark contrast between the heavy, masculine smoke of the dining room and the quiet, restorative potential of the drawing room represents the true fault line of Victorian social power. Bang 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 pert num, bang bang bang. The linguistic journey of the space where these women found refuge reveals a deeper, more intentional history than simple grammatical abbreviation. To trace the origins of the Victorian drawing room, one must unearth its 16th and 17th century architectural ancestor, the withdrawing room. In the sprawling manners of the Tudor and Stuart eras, the Great Hall was a chaotic, loud, and entirely public arena where servants, travellers, and labourers mingled without distinction. The master and mistress of the estate required a physical appendage to this public chaos, a secure space where they could literally withdraw from the relentless scrutiny of their dependents to conduct private, family business and find moments of absolute isolation. As centuries progressed and domestic architecture evolved to reflect the growing stratification of social classes, this room became increasingly specialized. By the arrival of the 19th century, the prefix was dropped by the rapid cadence of elite speech, transforming the withdrawing room into the drawing room. Yet, this linguistic softening did not erase the core political function of the space. It merely institutionalized it into the daily schedule of high society. The act of withdrawing was not a passive retreat born of weakness or submission, but rather a deliberate, tactical relocation to establish an independent base of operations. In the rigid geometry of the Victorian worldview, men occupied the public sphere, a vast network of parliament houses, financial exchanges, universities, and private clubs that were legally and culturally barred to women. Within the domestic estate, the formal dining room served as an extension of this public masculine empire. Therefore, when the women rose from the dinner table to migrate to the drawing room, they were not merely changing rooms. They were crossing a highly significant geopolitical boundary within their own home. The drawing room was the only space in the entire grand estate where the patriarchal master of the house did not hold absolute sovereign jurisdiction. Here the power dynamic was completely inverted. A man, no matter his title, political office, or wealth, could only cross the threshold of the drawing room as a guest. He entered under the strict behavioural rules, social etiquette, and conversational surveillance dictated entirely by the female host. This spatial independence allowed the drawing room to become a sophisticated incubator for a unique form of social and intellectual freedom. Behind these doors, away from the judgmental glare of male political theorists and business magnates, women could drop the exhausting, performative masks of fragile Victorian submissiveness. The conversations that unfolded over the early afternoon hours were far from trivial. They were highly structured, deeply informed analyses of literature, philosophy, and local governance. The linguistic shift from the active verb of withdrawing to the settled noun of the drawing room represents the stabilization of this female territory. It was no longer just a temporary hiding place to escape the suffocating smoke of the dining room. It had become a permanent, fortified institution where the soft power of an entire generation of women was quietly drawn, cultivated, and unleashed upon the wider world. Bung 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 parp sow bung 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 bung. The architectural engineering of the Victorian drawing room was not merely an exercise in aesthetic luxury, but a highly scientific response to the overwhelming sensory assault of the Industrial Revolution. Outside the thick brick walls of these grand London estates, the city was undergoing a violent sonic transformation. The relentless clatter of iron-rimmed carriage wheels on rough granite cobblestones, the distant, low-frequency thrum of steam-powered factories, and the chaotic roar of an exploding urban population created a permanent state of auditory pollution. This acoustic chaos was recognized by contemporary medical minds as a primary source of nervous exhaustion, a physical ailment that disproportionately threatened the delicate poise required of high society. To counteract this external violence, the drawing room was systematically weaponized with soft, noise-absorbing materials, creating a deliberate sensory vacuum that allowed the human mind to rest, observe, and strategize. The primary defense mechanism within this space lay in the sophisticated application of heavy textile insulation, high expansive sash windows, which naturally served as conductors for both the bitter winter cold and the street noise, were entirely cloaked behind massive, multi-layered draperies. These curtains were constructed from dense, thick velvet and heavy brocade, often lined with additional layers of brushed flannel and silk. The sheer weight of these fabrics caused them to cascade in deep, even volumetric folds from the gilded ceiling cornices all the way to the floorboards, acting as a literal acoustic dampening blanket. These velvet barriers did not merely block light, they absorbed the high-frequency vibrations of the city, transforming the chaotic noise of the streets into a faint, entirely harmless murmur. Underfoot, the traditional bare hardwood floors of previous centuries were completely covered by expansive, custom-loomed wool carpets, specifically from the famous mills of Axminster and Wilton. These carpets were laid over thick underlays of compressed jute and animal hair, creating a dense, multi-tiered cushion that entirely swallowed the kinetic energy of human movement. The sound of a heavy boot or a rustling silk dress was instantly nullified upon contact with these fibers, reducing the physical presence of individuals to a silent, ghostly glide across the floor. This meticulous management of sound completely altered the nature of human communication within the room. In a public space or a wood-panelled dining room, voices had to compete with echoes and background reverberations, forcing a higher, more strained pitch of delivery. But within the acoustic sanctuary of the drawing room, the sound absorption was so absolute that the human voice could drop to its lowest, most natural register. Here, a gentle whisper or a subtle clearing of the throat could be heard with perfect, crystal clarity across the entire expanse of the room. This quietness did not invite emptiness. Instead, it concentrated the power of spoken word, allowing women to conduct complex social negotiations and share sensitive political intelligence without ever needing to raise their voices. As we rest within the absolute, manufactured stillness of this historic sanctuary, it is comforting to remember that this content was developed with the assistance of advanced AI tools and has been meticulously reviewed, verified, and edited by the editorial team at Whispers of Centuries. All rights reserved. Until next time, listen closely to the whispers of the past, because you never know what timeless wisdom might quietly find its way into your night. Bang bang bang, Parp Bay bang bang bang. The psychological impact of the drawing room's physical layout extended far beyond its acoustic architecture. Every piece of furniture, every placement of a silk-upholstered armchair, and the precise angling of the low tea tables were calibrated to foster an atmosphere of egalitarian intimacy, entirely opposite to the cold linear hierarchy of the formal dining room. In the dining room, guests were locked into fixed positions along a massive, unyielding table, forced to face one another in structured, confrontational lines that mimic the adversarial nature of Parliament. But within the drawing room, the seating arrangement was fluid, organic, and intentionally scattered. Low, deeply cushioned sofas and elegant sociables, shaped couches designed specifically for private, face-to-face conversation, allowed individuals to lean close, their bodies relaxed but their minds sharply focused. The natural light of the fading afternoon poured through the tall glass pane, thus pooling across the polished wood tables and casting a warm, lazy amber glow over the room. This light did not expose or interrogate. It softened the expressions of those present, creating an unspoken zone of psychological safety where defense mechanisms could be lowered and true connection could begin. At the literal and symbolic center of this environment was the fireplace, with the hearth that served as the engine of domestic comfort. In the Victorian worldview, the management of the hearth was the exclusive, spiritual and practical responsibility of the woman. To control the fire was to control the emotional climate of the home, a task that required both diligence and intuition. When a man entered this space, the shift in sovereignty was immediate and absolute. He left behind his public titles, his legal authority, and his parliamentary bravado at the threshold. In the drawing room, he could not simply command attendance or dominate the room through physical stature. The intentionally low seating forced him to abandon a posture of aggressive readiness, sinking instead into a position of respectful listening. He was required to adapt his voice to the quiet acoustics of the room and submit entirely to the conversational rhythms established by the female host. For a woman, this was not merely a decorative sitting room. It was her sovereign territory. Here she held the unwritten power to grant or deny social validation, to direct the flow of dialogue, and to quietly observe the behavior of those who sought her approval. As you allow yourself to sink deeper into the gentle stillness of this evening, letting your thoughts rest alongside the fadebebs of history, if you feel a sense of peace in these slow, meaningful journeys into the past, taking a moment to support our channel helps us keep this quiet sanctuary alive for you. A simple subscription or a gentle nod of appreciation ensures that we can continue to gather here, night after night, wrapping ourselves in the comforting safety of historical wisdom while the modern world fades away. The drawing room thus functioned as a crucial counterweight to the industrial, patriarchal machinery of the 19th century. It was a space where the currency of success was not measured in gold sovereigns or raw political leverage, but in the subtle nuances of emotional intelligence, wit, and social grace. By mastering this soft environment, women created a sanctuary that was entirely their own, a localized empire within the home that would soon expand its borders, reshaping the destiny of families and dynasties across the globe. It was the establishment of this physical sovereignty that paved the way for the next phase of the afternoon ritual. For once the space was secured, the true material value of the gathering could be unveiled, beginning with the highly protected, locked treasures of the tea assembly itself. Bang 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 part tam, bang bang bang. The establishment of the drawing room as a secure female territory immediately allowed for the introduction of its most valuable material asset, an asset that was guarded with a level of security that mirrors the modern management of a financial vault. To fully comprehend why the afternoon tea assembly was initially such an exclusive, deeply private affair, one must look past the modern perception of tea as a common, everyday beverage and analyze its 19th century reality as a highly volatile luxury commodity. In the early and mid-Victorian eras, tea was not merely a comfort, it was a physical manifestation of immense economic capital, an item so heavily taxed and highly prized that it was treated as a family reserve asset. For generations, the British Empire's obsession with Chinese tea had created a massive, unsustainable macroeconomic crisis. The Qing dynasty demanded payment for tea leaves exclusively in silver bullion, draining the liquid wealth of London's banks, and forcing the British state to implement extreme fiscal measures to control the consumption of this imported treasure and generate revenue for colonial expansion. The British government imposed astronomical import tariffs on tea, with taxes often exceeding 100% of the leaf's original value. This aggressive state taxation transformed the dried leaf into a luxury that, by weight, frequently surpassed the value of precious metals on the domestic market. A single pound of high-grade Darjeeling or delicate green tea represented a significant portion of a working man's monthly wage. It was a substance far too valuable to be left unprotected, and its presence in a home was a definitive indicator of elite socioeconomic status. Because of this staggering financial worth, the management of the tea supply within a grand estate was never entrusted to the domestic staff. In the rigid legal landscape of the 19th century, married women were largely denied the right to own external property or control independent bank accounts under English common law. However, within the domestic sphere, the control of the tea reserve served as a crucial, unrecognized loophole for female financial administration. The mistress of the house acted as the chief financial officer of this valuable resource. The tea leaves were never stored in the communal kitchen larders, alongside the flour, salt, or root vegetables, where they could be easily pilfered, traded, or diluted by servants. Instead, the tea was kept under lock and key within the drawing room itself, surviving as a closely audited, private treasury that only the matriarch had the legal and moral authority to access. When a guest was invited into the drawing room at 4 o'clock, the offering of a warm cup was an explicit, highly calculated display of economic generosity. Every individual present understood the precise monetary value of the liquid being consumed. To pour tea for a visitor was to willingly distribute a portion of the family's liquid wealth, making the ritual an exercise in high-stakes hospitality. The absolute privacy of the early afternoon tea room was therefore dictated by a practical need for economic security and social gatekeeping. One did not openly expose or consume an asset of etouge-hat volatile value in public or unstructured environments. The closed doors of the drawing room did not just keep out the damp London fog, they safely enclosed the physical capital that drew the definitive line between the ruling class and the rest of the world. Bang 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 parp cheen bang bang bang. The physical manifestation of this domestic financial control was worn directly upon the body of the matriarch, serving as an unmistakable symbol of her internal sovereignty. As she moved through the quiet corridors of the estate, a distinct rhythmic sound always preceded her, a sharp metallic clinking of keys that signalled her approach to both servants and family members alike. This sound was produced by the chatelaine, a highly specialised, ornate silver or steel device that was securely fastened to the reinforced waistband of her heavy silk skirt or corset. From this central decorative hook hung a series of delicate cascading chains, each terminating in a vital implement of domestic governance: small silver scissors, a thimble case, a personal wax seal, and most importantly, the small, intricate keys that unlocked the most valuable private reserves of the household. In the anthropological context of the 19th century, the chatelaine was far more than an item of high fashion or decorative jewellery. It was a visible badge of office, an explicit declaration of administrative rank within the home. To carry the keys was to hold the ultimate executive authority over the internal economy of the estate. This physical custody carried an immense psychological and social weight, particularly when examined against the highly restrictive legal landscape of the Victorian era. Under the historic English legal doctrine of coverture, a woman's independent legal existence was entirely suspended upon her marriage. Her legal rights, her ability to enter into contracts, and her ownership of any external property were completely subsumed by those of her husband. Legally, a married woman owned nothing, as her identity was legally dissolved into that of her spouse. Yet, the day-to-day management of the drawing room created a profound practical contradiction to this harsh legal reality. While the state denied women the right to manage public funds or vote in Parliament, the absolute necessity of protecting volatile domestic assets, like imported tea and sugar, forced a devolution of economic agency directly into their hands. The keys attached to the chatelaine represented a localized, sovereign jurisdiction that men rarely dared to interfere with. By keeping the key to the mahogany tea caddy physically attached to her waist, the mistress of the house maintained an unbroken chain of custody over the family's domestic capital. Though it was a silent, daily negotiation of power that took place right at the waistline. The husband might hold the legal deed to the grand townhouse, but he could not access the prestigious afternoon comforts of his own home without his wife's administrative consent. This domestic governance served as a vital, unrecorded testing ground for female leadership and organizational strategy. Decades before the formal passage and gradual evolution of the Married Women's Property Acts began to legally dismantle the absolute restrictions of coverture. The chatelaine, with its quiet metallic whisper against the fabric of her dress, was the physical instrument through which women maintained a firm, unyielding grip on the economic levers of private life. Bang 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 part mui, bang bang bang. The journey of the key from the silver chain of the chatelaine finds its ultimate destination in a singular, deeply symbolic object resting permanently upon the drawing room sideboard, the tea caddy. This item was far more than a decorative box. It was a physical manifestation of defensive luxury, a miniature vault constructed from the rarest materials the global trade networks could provide, typically crafted from heavy, polished Honduran mahogany, dark Ceylon ebony, or fine tortoise shell. The exterior of the caddy was designed to catch the soft amber glow of the fireplace, presenting a surface of flawless, reflecting elegance, yet its beauty was entirely secondary to its defensive purpose. The box was fitted ver capite heart heavy, custom cast brass or silver escutcheons, and a highly secure double lock system, requiring a specific hand-filed key to open its contents. Inside this secure wooden fortress, the layout resembled a meticulously planned treasury. The interior was divided into distinct, isolated compartments, each lined with thin sheets of beaten lead or tin foil. This lining served a dual purpose. It preserved the delicate, volatile oils of the costly frime, the dampness of the English air, and it prevented the distinct aroma of the tea from escaping and revealing its presence. One compartment usually held the dark, robust black teas from the newly established plantations of Assam, while the other held the delicate, pale green leaves, imported from the fading ports of China. In the centre, a heavy-cut glass blending bowl often sat, where the mistress of the house could personally mix the leaves to suit the specific palates of her esteemed guests. If these quiet, deep dives into the hidden layers of our shared past bring a sense of calm to your evening, you might consider taking a gentle moment to like this video or share your thoughts in the comments below. Your quiet presence and soft engagement in our space help sustain this peaceful sanctuary, allowing us to continue weaving these soothing tapestries of history for you, night after night, as the modern world fades away. The physical presence of the locked tea caddy in the drawing room served as a constant, unyielding architectural boundary between the ruling elite and the domestic servants who maintained the household. In a grand Victorian townhouse, the hierarchy of labour was absolute, and mistrust was an institutionalised reality. Servants were paid meagre wages and lived in cold, subterranean basement quarters, completely cut off from the luxuries they brushed past every morning. The temptation to pilfer even a small pinch of tea leaves was immense, as tea could be traded on the black market or used to bring comfort to their own impoverished families. To prevent this, the tea caddy remained locked at all times. Leaving it open was considered a severe administrative failure on the part of the matriarch, a dangerous lapse in vigilance that threatened the economic and moral order of the home. The locked box stood as a silent material reminder of class separation. It signalled that while the servants had the physical strength to carry the heavy silver kettles and sweep the hearth, they did not possess the moral trust or social standing required to touch the sovereign leaves within. The caddy was a monument to suspicion dressed in the guise of elegance, drawing a line in the polished wood that no dependent was ever permitted to cross. Bang 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 part me mort, bang bang bang. The physical preparation of the afternoon tea ritual required a massive amount of hidden, exhausting labour that took place far below the elegant floorboards of the drawing room, deep within the damp, subterranean kitchens of the townhouse. A complex machine of domestic service was constantly operating to support the quiet comforts of the elite upper class. Here, away from the soft light of the fireplace and the absorbing wool carpets, the environment was defined by the oppressive heat of massive coal-fired iron ranges, the rough scraping of heavy cast-iron pots, and the relentless humidity of boiling water. It was the exclusive domain of the lower-class domestic servants, who spent their entire lives performing the heavy, mechanical tasks necessary to maintain the flawless illusion of effortless aristocratic life. Yet, despite their total responsibility for the physical creation of the heat, these workers were completely stripped of any creative agency or personal involvement in the ritual itself. The most critical element of the afternoon assembly was the boiling water, a substance that required precise timing and physical strength to transport. When the clock struck the quarter hour before 4, a footman or housemaid was tasked with lifting the massive, heavy silver or copper kettle from the roaring kitchen fires. This vessel, filled to the brim with scalding water, was a dense, awkward weight that strained the muscles of the arms and back. The servant was required to carry this boiling burden up several flights of steep, cold stone staircases that wound from the basement up into the residential heart of the house. As they crossed the threshold from the uncarpeted servants' quarters into the quiet, uncanny, plush hallways of the family estate, an unyielding rule of absolute social invisibility came into immediate effect. The servant was expected to move like a ghost, eyes permanently cast downward toward the carpet, shoulders rounded, and breath held in check to ensure they never directly initiated contact or caught the eye of a guest or family member. When the servant entered the drawing room, the sensory contrast was immense. The smell of stale coal dust and sweat that clung to their stiff, heavy wool uniform was a silent, jarring intrusion into the refined air of dried lavender and rich wood. They approached the low tea table with deliberate, agonized slowness, focusing every ounce of their remaining physical energy on keeping the heavy steaming kettle perfectly still. The rising heat from the spout curled into the air, dampening their face. But their expression remained a blank, expressionless mask. Under the watchful, critical gaze of the mistress of the house, the servant carefully lowered the scalding metal vessel onto a small, elevated silver trivet resting beside the locked tea caddy. The action required a terrifying degree of precision to allow the heavy metal base to strike the silver stand with a sharp, loud clink, or to spill a single drop of water onto the polished mahogany table was a catastrophic failure of discipline that could result in immediate dismissal without a reference. The very instant the kettle was safely placed, the servant's physical function in the room was completely exhausted. They were never permitted to touch the silver tea handles, handle the porcelain cups, or participate in the actual brewing of the leaves. Etiquette dictated that they must immediately turn and execute a silent backward retreat toward the heavy oak doors, ensuring they never turned their back on the assembly. With a soft, barely audible click, the door latched shut behind them, and they vanished back down into the darkness of the basement stairs. This immediate, mandatory withdrawal was a calculated social necessity. The presence of a domestic servant in the room, with their lower-class accent and physical markers of hard labour, threatened the delicate, secure atmosphere of privacy that the upper-class women required. The closing of the door served as a vital purification process. It cleansed the drawing room of the reality of manual labour, instantly transforming the space back into an isolated, secure sanctuary. Only when the disenfranchised servitude was entirely removed from the room could the true, sophisticated performance of the afternoon tea begin, leaving the mistress of the house in absolute, unchallenged control of the boiling element. Bung 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 part me high bung bung bung. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut and the physical presence of the servant vanished, but the atmosphere in the drawing room shifted from the preparation of labour to the elite performance of measurement. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, the mistress of the house reached toward the silver chain of her chatelaine, selecting the smallest, most intricate key from the cluster. The crisp, metallic sound of the key sliding into the brass lock of the mahogany tea caddy was the true opening note of the afternoon ritual. It was a sound that commanded immediate, respectful silence from everyone present in the room. As she turned the key, the heavy brass mechanism gave a soft, solid click, a mechanical confirmation that the private treasury of the family was now open. The heavy wooden lid rose slowly, revealing the gleaming, lead-lined chambers within, and instantly releasing a wave of dry, complex aromas into the still air. A sharp fragrance of dried orange peel, the deep earthiness of fermented black leaves, and the faint, ghostly sweetness of far-off eastern ports. The act of extracting the tea leaves was treated not as a mundane chore, but as a highly calculated display of economic precision and social grace. For this task, the host did not use a common utensil, but a specialized silver tool known as the caddy spoon. This object was a miniature piece of sculpture, often fashioned in the shape of a scalloped seashell or a delicate oak leaf, with a handle intentionally designed to be short and wide so it could rest permanently inside the small wooden chambers. Every eye in the drawing room watched with absolute fascination as her fingers caroused the polished silver handle. She did not rush. To move quickly would betray a lack of composure, a sign of nervous agitation that high society deeply looked down upon. Instead, her hand moved with a slow rhythmic elegance, lowering the silver spoon into the dark, tightly rolled leaves of the Assam Reserve. The metal dipped into the dry leaves with a faint, soft rustling sound, like winter wind blowing through dry autumn grass. Each scoop of the caddy spoon was a precisely measured unit of wealth, an unspoken demonstration of the family's liquid capital. The mistress lifted the spoon, holding it steady for a brief, calculated moment over the open caddy, allowing her guests to visually audit the quality and abundance of the leaf. The dark, twisted ribbons of tea contrasted sharply against the reflective, bright silver of the spoon. She transferred the leaves into the preheated silver teapot. They kept had a motion that was entirely smooth, ensuring not a single fragment fell onto the polished wood table. To waste even a small grain of this heavily taxed commodity was a sign of poor domestic management. She repeated the motion with mathematical consistency, adjusting the quantity based on the exact number of guests present, demonstrating an intimate, expert knowledge of domestic economy and hospitality. This was her unique stage, where her absolute control over the family's assets was physically manifested through the steady, elegant manipulation of silver and leaf. The final stage of this introductory performance was the union of the dry leaves with the scalding water. Lifting the heavy silver kettle from its trivet, the mistress poured a thin, steady stream of boiling water directly into the open mouth of the teapot. The sound inside the quiet room changed instantly, transitioning from a sharp, hollow splash against the metallic bottom to a deep, muffled gurgle as the water level rose and the dried leaves began to unfurl and dance in the heat. The rising steam carried the full, robust aroma of the brewing tea into the velvet-draped space, warming the faces of the guests and sealing the boundaries of their private sanctuary. With a gentle click, the silver lid of the teapot was lowered into place, beginning the mandatory minutes of steeping. This brief period of waiting was a time of absolute conversational suspension, a shared stillness where the entire room rested in expectation. The performance of measurement was complete. The raw, volatile assets of global trade had been successfully domesticated, secured, and orchestrated by the sole authority of the female host. This initial phase of the afternoon had successfully established the structural, architectural, and financial foundations of the room. The stage was now perfectly set for these isolated elements of soft power to ripple outward, transforming this intimate 4 o'clock refuge into a formidable apparatus of social dominance and historical change. Bang 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 part mui bar bang bang bang. The transition of the afternoon tea ritual from an isolated physiological remedy into a vast, interconnected network of social power marks one of the most significant, unwritten transformations in 19th century elite culture. What began as a desperate, individual act of bodily recovery within the private dressing rooms of a hungry duchess quickly replicated across the wealthy districts of London, evolving into an informal but supreme apparatus of female diplomacy. As the habit migrated out of the absolute secrecy of the bedchamber and settled permanently into the formal drawing rooms of the wider aristocracy, it completely shed its status as a mere lifestyle trend, transforming instead into a sophisticated node of political and social organization. To understand the rapid institutionalization of this 4 o'clock network, one must analyze the total absence of formal, legal avenues for female engagement during the mid-Victorian era, the legal and political machinery of Westminster, the vast financial boardrooms of the City of London, and even the exclusive gentlemen-s clubs along Pall Mall were aggressively, systematically barred to women. A woman, regardless of her intelligence, lineage, or wealth, possessed no formal legislative vote, no right to hold public office, and no direct voice in the visible administration of the British Empire. Faced with this absolute systemic exclusion, the women of the ruling class did not merely submit to passivity. Instead, they brilliantly repurposed the domestic drawing room during the afternoon tea hour to function as an alternate, highly effective arena of influence. The genius of this newly established network lay in its deceptively innocent, non-threatening appearance. To the husbands, politicians, and social commentators of the era, the afternoon tea gathering was frequently dismissed as a trivial, harmless assembly of women consuming sweet pastries and light warm beverages. It was masked by a veneer of domestic comfort and feminine triviality, which served as a perfect cloak of invisibility. Underneath this pleasant surface, the afternoon tea room operated with the cold, strategic precision of a political committee. Within this space, a woman did not require a formal parliamentary seat to exert profound leverage over the affairs of the state. By controlling the physical parameters of the gathering, the female host established an independent system of social credit, validation, and patronage that could make or break public careers. As the network expanded, individual drawing rooms began to specialize, creating an intricate web of alliance across London. A guest could move from a tea room focused heavily on literary and artistic patronage to another that served as the hidden headquarters for the progressive wing of the Whig Party. The conversations that flowed over the silver teapots were far from idle gossip. They were highly calculated exchanges of social capital. Alliances were quietly forged, political reputations were vetted, and family dynasties were strategically aligned, all before the men had even finished their cigars in the dining room below. The afternoon tea room had successfully evolved from a quiet refuge into a formidable self-sustaining institution, a velvet-clad fortress of soft power where the unspoken rules of the ruling class were formulated and the invisible strings of historical destiny were quietly pulled. Bang bang pap, muy bon, bang bang bang. The currency that fueled this vast invisible network of soft power was not gold sovereigns, but a small, deceptive piece of glazed white pasteboard, the calling card. To an outsider, this tiny rectangle of paper, neatly engraved with an individual S name and title, might appear to be a trivial accessory of daily life. But in the rigid socio-political ecosystem of Victorian London, the calling card was an absolute weapon of exclusion. It functioned as the primary social filter of its era, a material gatekeeper that determined vacapite, hat, absolute certainty, who was permitted to step past the heavy oak thresholds into the sacred sanctuary of the afternoon tea room, and who was condemned to remain outside in the cold. The ritual of leaving cards was governed by an unyielding, incredibly complex matrix of etiquette that required precise physical execution. Every afternoon between the hours of 3 and 5, the carriages of the wealthy would circulate through the streets of Belgravia and Mayfair, carrying women who were performing the rigorous duties of social preservation. When a carriage pulled up to a grand townhouse, the visitor did not simply walk inside. Instead, a footman would ascend the stone steps to present her card to the butler at the door. The reception of this card was the first crucial line of defence. Inside the entryway of every prestigious home sat a highly polished silver card tray, a small reflective vessel that held the accumulated social credit of the household. The butler would carefully place the newly arrived card onto this silver tray, where it would remain on public display for a limited time, allowing other visitors to casually audit the caliber of the home's social connections. The physical treatment of the card itself contained a secret, sophisticated language known only to the initiated elite. A lady would frequently fold a specific corner of the white card before presenting it to the servant. A tiny, almost imperceptible crease that carried immense semantic weight, folding the upper right corner of the card, indicated that the lady had arrived in person and was sitting in her carriage outside rather than merely sending a domestic servant to drop off the paper. This single, small crease transformed a cold, administrative object into a deep sign of personal respect and social investment. Other folds could communicate messages of congratulation, condolence, or a formal farewell before leaving London for the country estate. It was a silent, paper-based semaphore system that bypassed the need for spoken words, allowing the elite to communicate intention, status, and availability with perfect understated efficiency. The true systemic power of the calling card system was revealed during the mandatory period of review. Every evening, the mistress of the house would examine the silver card tray, meticulously auditing the pasteboard offerings left at her door. Here she held the absolute power of social life and death over those who sought her acquaintance. If she decided to accept the visitor into her network, she was required by etiquette to return a calling card of her own to the visitor's home within a strict window of a few days. This mutual exchange of paper was a formal validation, an official treaty of social recognition that unlocked the doors to the afternoon tea room. But if the mistress chose to ignore the card, leaving it unanswered and unreturned, it resulted in a devastating, permanent social rejection. It was a silent execution of an individual's social ambitions. By simply refusing to return a piece of paper, a powerful host could isolate an entire family, rendering them invisible and untouchable within high society. The calling card tray was thus a brutal mechanism of class preservation, a sorting machine that ensured only the most refined, politically aligned, and socio-economically pristine individuals were ever allowed to sit beside the silver teapot. Bung 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 part, mue lam bung bung bung. The dark underbelly of this sophisticated paper currency was the silent, devastating execution of social status known as velvet ostracism. In the ultra-refined, hyper-vigilant ecosystem of Victorian high society, power was rarely exercised through loud, public confrontations or dramatic banishments. Instead, the most lethal punishments were entirely passive, carried out through the simple, chilling withholding of an invitation to the afternoon tea table. To be excluded from the tea room of a prominent London matriarch was not merely an administrative oversight, it was an institutional declaration of social death. When a family or an individual committed a breach of the unwritten social code, whether through a financial misstep in the city, an inappropriate association, or a perceived lack of deference to the established elite, the mechanism of punishment was immediate but entirely silent. The mistress of a grand house would sit at her writing desk in the morning, her fountain pen hovering over a bound leather book containing the names of her social network. With a single smooth stroke of ink, a name would be crossed out, There was no letter of notification sent, no explanation offered, and no opportunity for defence. The family in question would simply realise, as the days turned into weeks, that the silver card tray in their entryway remained completely empty. The carriages of Mayfair and Belgravia would roll past their stone steps without stopping, the occupants straight ahead, pretending the house did not exist. The consequences of this velvet freeze were catastrophic, sending ruinous ripples through every layer of a family's existence. In the Victorian era, a family's economic survival and political leverage were entirely dependent on their social validation. When the drawing room doors were shut against a family at 4 o'clock, their daughters were instantly excluded from the highly structured marriage market. No eligible bachelor from a reputable house would dare court a young woman whose mother could not secure a seat near the silver teapot of an influential duchess. The sons found themselves quietly blackballed from the elite gentleman S clubs along Pall Mall, their applications rejected without explanation. Even the patriarch of the family, navigating the masculine spheres of parliament or high finance, would find his influence mysteriously evaporating. The informal agreements, the whispered stock tips, and the political alliances that were traditionally solidified in the drawing room during the tea hour were suddenly denied to him. He would speak in the House of Commons only to find his colleagues listening with a cold, detached indifference. This absolute isolation was called being cut dead. It was a psychological torture masquerading as perfect politeness. If a blacklisted individual chanced to meet a former acquaintance on the gravel paths of Hyde Park, the acquaintance would look directly into their eyes, with a blank, unrecognizing stare, passing by as if encountering a ghost. The afternoon tea room was the Supreme Court, where these invisible sentences were passed and executed. It was a system that transformed the domestic home into a judicial apparatus of class purity. The soft power of the velvet curtains was not just used to comfort those inside, it was a weapon used to preserve the boundaries of the ruling class, ensuring that anyone who threatened the established order was quietly, cleanly, and permanently erased from the memory of the empire. Bung 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 part muya sao, bung bung bung. As the 19th century moved into its final decades, the insular network of the British elite was forced to open its heavy oak doors to a radical, foreign economic force, a phenomenon that would fundamentally rewrite the financial foundations of the aristocracy. Because this was the era of the transatlantic exchange. Driven by the arrival of the dollar princesses, in the United States the Gilded Age had produced an unprecedented explosion of industrial wealth. Families like the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Rockefellers had accumulated massive, unimaginable fortunes through railroads, steel, and oil. Yet, despite their overwhelming financial dominance, these American industrial titans lacked the one thing that gold could not instantly buy in New York: historical legitimacy, ancient titles, and entry into the absolute highest tiers of global social recognition. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the traditional British peerage was facing a catastrophic systemic crisis. A severe agricultural depression had caused the rental values of land to plummet, leaving old noble families cash poor, heavily indebted, and entirely unable to afford the astronomical maintenance costs of their sprawling country estates. The afternoon tea room became the primary, covert trading floor where these two desperate global forces negotiated a historic compromise. Merging American capital with British aristocratic prestige required a highly controlled, deeply subtle environment. It could not occur in the vulgar glare of public hotels or the aggressive domain of lawyers' offices. Instead, The drawing room during the 4 o'clock hour served as the perfect, if non-threatening arena for these high-stakes matrimonial transactions. Here, over delicate porcelain cups and silver platters, wealthy American mothers presented their beautiful, highly educated daughters to cash-strapped British dukes, earls and marquises. It was a sophisticated stock exchange, masquerading as an innocent tea party. Every element of the conversation was a carefully masked calculation, a complex ledger where millions of American dollars were silently balanced against centuries-old coats of arms, hereditary seats in the House of Lords, and historic royal lineages. As these two worlds collided over the tea table, the subtle shifts in global power were quietly negotiated through the lift of a teacup. If you find comfort in exploring these intricate, hidden corners of our shared past each night, taking a gentle moment to engage with our narrative helps us continue building this quiet sanctuary for your sleep. By subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or sharing these peaceful histories with others who seek rest, you ensure that our library of stories remains a calm, dark haven where the modern world can fade away into the soft echoes of the past. The physical layout of the drawing room was brilliantly leveraged by matriarchs to manage the deep cultural anxieties of this transatlantic merger. American heiresses, raised in the relatively fluid, energetic social structures of New York and Newport, often found the rigid frozen etiquette of the British upper class to be incredibly suffocating. The tea hour offered a crucial compromise, a semi-formal space that was less intimidating than a state banquet, yet strict enough to test an outsider-esque composure. British mothers would sit behind their silver teapots, using the precise movements of the tea service to closely interrogate the manners, the vocal cadence, and the psychological resilience of these wealthy American invaders. They watched for any sign of brashness, any slip of vocabulary that betrayed a background in trade rather than inherited leisure. On the other side of the table, the young American women used their quick wit, confidence, and immense wealth to redefine the terms of their submissive roles. They were not merely marrying into the aristocracy, they were actively purchasing their way into history, because the millions of dollars brought across the Atlantic by these women would single-handedly repair the leaking roofs of Blenheim Palace, restore the ancient tapestries of thousands of decaying country manors, and infuse the stagnant British Empire with a massive surge of vital economic energy. The afternoon tea room had successfully evolved from a local filter of class into a global machine of dynastic survival, a quiet velvet-lined space where the financial map of the modern world was permanently redrawn, one marriage contract at a time. Bang 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 partmuir bay bang bang bang. Behind the pleasant, clinking porcelain of the afternoon tea table lay a covert psychological crucible known among the elite as the silent interview. While public courtship was often displayed in the grand ballrooms of Mayfair under the blinding glare of gas, chandeliers, the true definitive evaluation of a person's character occurred in the intimate, quiet proximity of the 4 o'clock tea room. Here, stripped of the loud music, the distracting crowds, and the performative movements of the dance floor, young women and prospective suitors alike were subjected to an intense, hyper-vigilant scrutiny conducted by the seasoned matriarchs of the ruling class. It was an environment designed specifically to apply a gentle, invisible pressure, testing the absolute limits of an individual's emotional disciplines, social intelligence, and psychological endurance. The tea table itself was arranged as a psychological minefield, where every object served as a potential instrument of exposure. The seasoned host, sitting comfortably behind her massive silver tea service, would intentionally create subtle, unspoken traps to observe how a guest responded under sudden discomfort. She might offer a cup of tea that was dangerously full, or pass a plate of delicate pastries that required immense physical coordination to consume without dropping crumbs onto the thick wool carpet. To the untrained eye, these were simple gestures of hospitality. To the initiated, they were rigorous practical examinations. The matriarch would watch with a detached, hawk-like intensity, her gaze tracking the microscopic movements of the guest hands. She noted whether the fingers trembled as they kemped the fragile porcelain saucer, whether the chin tilted too high in a defensive posture, or if the eyes darted anxiously around the room, seeking reassurance. A single sudden clink of a silver spoon against the bone china, or a faint, nervous catch in the throat while answering a question, was instantly registered as a profound systemic vulnerability. The conversations that occurred during this silent interview were masterclasses in double-coded language. The host would rarely ask direct, vulgar questions about a family's financial status, political allegiances, or private moral scandals. Instead, she would deliver soft, beautifully polished remarks that carried sharp, subterranean probes. She might casually mention a mutual acquaintance who had recently suffered a financial setback in the city, or comment on a controversial piece of legislation moving through Parliament, then fall perfectly silent, letting the quiet weight of the room press upon the guest. The speed of the response was just as critical as the content. A reply delivered too quickly betrayed a lack of emotional control and a dangerous desperation to please. A response delayed too long indicated an unpolished mind or a hidden deception. The guest was required to balance a multi-tiered performance simultaneously. They had to maintain a perfectly smooth, relaxed facial expression, deliver an intelligent, politically safe answer, and gracefully manipulate a scalding cup of tea without ever looking down at their hands. The stakes of this silent evaluation were monumentally high for the survival of the aristocratic dynasty. The matriarchs who commanded these drawing rooms understood that the young women passing through their doors were the home, potential future guardians of their family's vast fortunes, ancient titles, and historical secrets. A woman who cracked under the mild psychological pressure of a 4 o'clock drawing room was deemed entirely unfit to manage a massive country estate, govern a small army of domestic servants, or withstand the brutal public scrutiny of London high society. She would be a liability to her future husband's political career, and a threat to the pristine reputation of the bloodline. Conversely, a young woman who navigated the silent interview with a calm, unshakable poise, maintaining her composure even when faced with calculated slights or difficult social situations, was recognized as a valuable asset. She was a master of self-regulation, a quality prized above all others in a ruling class that maintained its empire through an illusion of effortless superiority. The afternoon tea room was thus a supreme proving ground, a velvet-lined chamber where the raw psychological capacity of the next generation was tested, was weighed and decided, one silent look at a time. Bang 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 part muir tam bang bang bang. The immense consolidation of soft power within the private drawing room eventually generated an unstoppable pressure that shattered the physical boundaries of the aristocratic home. To fully comprehend the next radical evolution of the afternoon tea ritual, one must examine the profound crisis of public geography that restricted the daily lives of 19th century women. In the mid-Victorian era, the public streets of major industrial cities like London were strictly gendered territories. A respectable middle or upper-class woman was culturally and socially prohibited from navigating the urban landscape without a formal chaperone or a male protector. The public sphere, composed of bustling thoroughfares, commercial dining rooms, traditional taverns, and elite political clubs, was engineered entirely by and for men. If a woman ventured into a conventional restaurant or hotel dining room, unchaperoned, she was instantly subjected to intense moral suspicion. Society automatically categorized an unaccompanied woman in a public eating establishment as a person of questionable virtue, a social outcast, or a fallen woman. This geographical imprisonment meant that while women held absolute sovereignty over the domestic hearth at 4 o'clock, they were entirely disenfranchised the moment they stepped past their own front doors, unable to even pause for a light meal or a drink during a day of shopping or travel. The structural breakthrough that dissolved this spatial apartheid occurred in the late 1860s, driven not by a political decree, but by a brilliant commercial adaptation of the afternoon tea ritual. The catalyst was the aerated bread company, popularly known as the ABC shops, originally established as a commercial bakery chain using an automated process to manufacture bread, because an observant female manager of a London branch made a revolutionary operational decision. She began serving cups of fresh tea alongside light-baked goods to her female customers in a small, quiet back room of the bakery. The response was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in British history, women discovered a public commercial space that was entirely respectable, clean, and safe to enter completely alone. Recognizing a massive untapped market, entrepreneurs began establishing dedicated, lavishly decorated public tea rooms throughout the high-end shopping districts of London, such as Oxford Street and Piccadilly. These commercial spaces deliberately replicated the acoustic and visual luxuries of the private aristocratic drawing room. They utilized thick carpets to dampen the roar of the street, installed large mirrors to maximize the sense of secure light, and provided clean, private lavatories, an essential urban amenity that had previously been completely denied to women in public spaces. The public tea room quickly transformed from a simple commercial convenience into a formidable crucible for social and political revolution. By providing a universally recognized space where women could meet, converse, and organize without the surveillance of fathers, husbands, or domestic staff, the tea room became the hidden birthplace of modern urban female autonomy. It was here, over commercial teapots and shared platters of scones, that the early pioneers of the women's suffrage movement found their strategic headquarters. The leaders of the suffrage societies systematically utilized public tea rooms like the famous Lions' Corner houses and the elegant tea galleries of major department stores like Harrods to conduct covert political planning. They chose these spaces precisely because they were completely invisible to the patriarchal authorities. A police detective or a conservative politician walking past a tea room windows would see nothing more than a peaceful group of women engaging in a traditionally feminine domestic habit. Underneath this deceptive veneer of polite consumption, these women were actively printing illegal pamphlets, organizing mass street demonstrations, and coordinating sophisticated lobbying campaigns designed to dismantle the very foundations of the British Constitution. The afternoon tea ritual had effectively weaponized its own domestic reputation, using the web of social validation to shelter a radical movement for democratic liberation. This geographical expansion of the tea room fundamentally democratized not as Turks the consumption of the luxury leaf, permanently altering the class structure of the empire. As the ritual moved out of the heavily guarded, locked mahogany caddies of Mayfair into the accessible, affordable commercial spaces of the high street, the sharp socio-economic boundaries that had defined the earlier decades of the century began to soften. A middle-class shop clerk, a female school teacher, or a university student could now purchase a pot of tea for a few copper coins, gaining temporary access to the same refined sensory environment, quiet dignity, and physical rest that had once been the exclusive birthright of a duchess. The material culture of the tea room adapted to this mass democratization, transitioning from fragile porcelain to durable, mass-produced earthenware and sturdy silver-plated pots that could withstand the rapid cadence of commercial service. Yet even as it became a mass cultural phenomenon, the tea room never lost its core psychological function as a sanctuary of self-regulation and emotional calm. It remained an urban oasis where the individual could step out of the exhausting, chaotic machinery of the industrial city, recalibrate their mind within a space of soft light and quiet acoustics, and claim a vital pocket of personal sovereignty. The journey of the tea leaf was now complete. It had evolved from a volatile colonial treasure locked in a private vault into the physical engine of a public social transformation, quietening the chaos of the outer world while rewriting the history of human freedom. Bung 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 pop, we chin bung bung. The ultimate refinement of the afternoon tea assembly manifested not just in the macro structures of spatial sovereignty or global economics, but in the hyper-focused microscopic choreography of physical consumption. The material objects resting upon the tea table were not passive vessels. They were active testing instruments designed to expose the exact cultural lineage of whoever touched them. At the apex of this material hierarchy was the porcelain itself, an extraordinary technological achievement that had taken European manufacturers over a century of intense industrial espionage to replicate. For generations, the thin, translucent porcelain imported from China had been a source of profound mystery and envy. When cold milk or boiling water was poured into crude European earthenware, the thermal shock would cause the vessel to crack, shatter, or weep moisture through its porous clay. But Chinese porcelain possessed a miraculous thermal resilience, remaining pristine, cool to the touch at the rim, and beautifully resonant when struck. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, British innovators like Josiah Spode had perfected a uniquely domestic solution, bone china, by introducing calcined animal bone ash into the traditional clay mixture. British potteries created a material that surpassed even the original Chinese imports in its dazzling, pure whiteness and structural strength. This material breakthrough allowed potters to manufacture cups with walls of impossible thinness, so delicate that when held up to the soft amber glow of the drawing room fireplace, the silhouette of the drinker's fingers could be clearly seen through the translucent body of the vessel. This extreme fragility was an intentional design feature. A heavy, thick mug belonged to the tavern or the kitchen basement. It spoke of manual labour, rough handling, and a lack of sensory refinement. The bone china cup, by contrast, demanded an exquisite lightness of touch. To hold it required an absolute calibration of the muscles in the hand, a physical performance that instantly separated those who had been raised from infancy, surrounded by luxury, from those who had merely purchased their way into the room. The physical anatomy of the teacup underwent a slow, highly significant, ergonomic evolution that mirrored the changing demands of social etiquette. The earliest cups imported from China were entirely handleless bowls, requiring the drinker to balance the hot clay carefully between the tips of the thumb and the index finger along the reinforced upper rim. This method of consumption forced a slow, measured pace, as the liquid could not be lifted if the vessel was too hot to hold. However, as the Victorian era institutionalized the afternoon ritual, British manufacturer added an architectural appendage to the cup, the handle. This tiny loop of porcelain was not a simple convenience. It was a structural device that introduced a completely new code of manual discipline. Etiquette dictated that a lady must never slide her index finger through the loop of the handle, a mistake that was viewed as a vulgar attempt to secure a heavy mechanical grip. Instead, the handle was to be pinched delicately between the thumb and the index finger, while the middle finger extended beneath the loop to provide a subtle, balancing support. The remaining fingers, particularly the pinky, were expected to curve slightly inward toward the palm, maintaining a compact, controlled profile. The widespread modern myth of the extended, rigid pinky finger was actually viewed by the true Victorian elite as an unpolished, hyper-correct affectation of the lower middle class, an anxious overextension that betrayed a desperate desire to appear refined. If you find solace in these deep, quiet unravelings of our material past, allowing the slow weight of history to smooth away the tensions of your day, taking a moment to align yourself with our space helps preserve this tranquil archive. Your gentle subscription to Whispers of Centuries, or your quiet return to these narratives night after night, ensures that this dark sanctuary remains open for all who seek to rest their minds within the comforting embrace of timeless stories. Nestled beneath the delicate cup was its indispensable structural companion, the saucer, originally utilized in the 18th century as a shallow vessel into which hot tea was actually poured to cool rapidly before drinking, a habit that survived long into the 19th century among the working classes. The saucer was completely repurposed by Victorian high society to serve as a defensive shield. It was held permanently in the non-dominant hand, lifted to chest height alongside the cup to catch any accidental droplets of liquid before they could soil the expensive silk and satin dresses of the guests. The synchronization of the two hands, one lifting the cup, the other maintaining the perfect horizontal balance of the saucer, required a flawless kinetic harmony. To allow the cup to rattle against the saucer, producing a sharp metallic clinking sound, was a profound social error. It signalled a lack of inner tranquility, a nervous agitation that fractured the illusion of effortless poise. Perhaps the most fierce, intensely debated class marker within the entire material ritual was the precise chronological order in which the liquid elements were united in the cup. The division between miff and tiff, or milk in first versus tea in first. This was not a matter of personal culinary preference. It was a definitive, unforgivable diagnostic of socioeconomic origin. The habit of pouring milk into the cup before the tea had originated among the lower classes as a practical necessity. When pouring boiling tea into cheap, low-grade earthenware or poorly fired glass, the intense thermal shock would instantly fracture the vessel. By placing cold milk in the bottom of the cup first, the temperature of the incoming liquid was immediately moderated, protecting the fragile, inexpensive container from shattering. However, in the aristocratic drawing room, where the vessels were constructed of genuine, structurally flawless bone china, such defensive measures were completely unnecessary. Therefore, the elite established the absolute law of tea in first. To pour the rich, dark Assam or delicate Darjeeling into the cup first allowed the host to visually appreciate the clarity, colour, and quality of the brew before tempering it with a few drops of cream. For an individual to inadvertently place milk in their cup first was to betray an ancestral memory of poverty, an inherited domestic habit born of surviving with fragile, cheap pottery. even if an individual had accumulated millions in trade or married into a noble line. The simple, instinctive movement of reaching for the milk jug before the teapot was a catastrophic exposure. It revealed that underneath the expensive clothing and the polished vocabulary, their bloodline had been shaped by the survival tactics of the lower-class kitchen. The afternoon tea table was thus an absolute laboratory of behavioral surveillance, where the simplest physical alignment of bone, silver, and liquid served as an unyielding mirror, reflecting the exact boundaries of inherited privilege and social sour. Not bung 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 parp, hai mui bung bung bung. The culinary offerings, arranged upon the tiered silver afternoon tea stand, were not designed for basic nutrition, but were instead masterfully engineered as symbols of economic waste and somatic discipline. While the heavy dining room table downstairs groaned under the weight of calorie-dense roasted meats, thick gravies, and heavy root vegetables meant to fuel physical labour or long parliamentary debates, the afternoon tea menu was a deliberate exercise in dietary minimalism. Every morsel was structurally designed to be light, small, and entirely devoid of substantial nutritional value, serving as a material declaration that those consuming it existed completely outside the vulgar necessity of eating for survival. At the absolute apex of this culinary hierarchy sat the cucumber sandwich, an object that represented a profound triumph of aristocratic luxury over natural agriculture. In the 19th century, cucumbers were not the cheap year-round staple of the modern grocery store. They were an exceptionally volatile, expensive delicacy that required specialized technology to produce. To grow cucumbers in the damp, cold climate of England required massive, coal-heated glass greenhouses known as forcing houses. The expenditure of coal, glass, and intensive gardening labour required to produce a single crisp green cucumber out of season was astronomical, making the vegetable an explicit marker of high socio-economic capital. The physical construction of the sandwich was a lesson in architectural precision. The bread, manufactured from highly refined, bleached white flour, which was itself far more expensive than the rustic, whole-grain loaves consumed by the working classes, was sliced to an impossible uniform thinness. The kitchen staff was then instructed to perform an act of mandatory economic waste. The total removal of the crusts. In a working-class household, every crumb of bread was a vital unit of caloric energy to be preserved. To cut away and discard the dense nutritional crusts was an unthinkable sin. But in the drawing room, the discarding of the crusts was a calculated display of aristocratic indifference to waste. The cucumber itself was peeled completely, removing its bitter outer skin, and sliced so translucent that the pattern of the silver knife could be seen through the green flesh. It was lightly salted to draw out any excess moisture, ensuring the delicate bread remained perfectly dry, crisp, and immaculate. This absolute dryness was an operational necessity imposed by the strict laws of Victorian dress etiquette. An elite lady attending an afternoon assembly was almost always clad in pristine, form-fitting white kid skin gloves. These gloves, crafted from the finest, softest animal leather, were incredibly sensitive to oils, moisture, and stains. To touch a piece of food that left a greasy residue, a damp smudge, or a crumb upon the immaculate leather surface was a severe social disaster. It betrayed a clumsy handling of the body and corrupted the clean visual presentation required of high society. Therefore, the afternoon tea food was explicitly engineered to be finger food that left absolutely no trace of its consumption. The sandwiches were cut into precise, miniature rectangles or small triangles, designed to be lifted delicately with the tips of two gloved fingers and consumed in exactly 2 clean, noiseless bites. If you find deep relaxation in uncovering these hidden, intricate details of human history, letting the soft rhythms of the past ease your mind into a state of quiet comfort, taking a moment to support our journey ensures this sanctuary remains open for you every single evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a gentle mark of appreciation helps us keep weaving these slow, dark tapestries of storytelling, providing you with a reliable haven where the modern world can completely fade away. Beside the minimalist sandwiches sat the more robust, yet equally disciplined, scone. This baked good served as the stage for another intense, hyper-specific cultural debate that divided the British upper class along regional and lineage lines. The battle between the Devonshire and Cockneysh methods of assembly, and the scone was split open cleanly, never with a knife, but by gently pulling the baked halves apart with the fingers. The dilemma lay in the precise chronological order of the toppings. Did one apply the thick, velvety clotted cream first, followed by a dollop of sweet strawberry jam, or did the jam serve as the foundation for the cream? To the Devonshire traditionalist, the clotted cream acted as butter, and therefore had to be spread directly onto the warm surface of the scone first, allowing the heat to slightly soften the rich dairy fats before the cold jam was placed on top. To the Cornish advocate, the jam was the primary layer, spread directly onto the bread to seal the crumbs, while a generous crown of clotted cream was placed proudly at the summit. Within the high-stakes surveillance of the afternoon tea room, the method an individual chose was an instant diagnostic of their regional heritage, family education, and social alignment. A guest hands were closely watched as they assembled their scone. Any hesitation, any clumsy mixing of the dairy and fruit, or any attempt to eat the scone as a closed sandwich was registered as a failure of domestic refinement. The food of the tea room was never just a snack. It was a highly sophisticated testing apparatus, a geometric arrangement of sugar, flour, and luxury that demanded total somatic control, transforming the simple act of eating into a rigorous display of class dominance and historical identity. Bung 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 parp, Jaime mort bung bung bung. The absolute somatic control demanded by the afternoon tea table was balanced by a profound, revolutionary shift in the material culture of women's fashion. A transformation that offered a rare, radical moment of physical liberation from the structural torture of Victorian clothing. To understand the emergence of the tea gown, one must first examine the intense physical imprisonment that dictated a woman's daily life outside the sanctuary of the drawing room. Throughout the 19th century, the female body was treated as a site of rigorous architectural engineering. High society demanded a silhouette of impossible rigidity, achieved through the systematic application of the corset. This garment, constructed from heavy canvas and reinforced with unyielding strips of whalebone or tempered steel, was tightly laced around the torso from early childhood. The structural impact on the human anatomy was severe and agonizing. The corset forcefully compressed the lower ribs, displaced vital internal organs, and restricted the capacity of the lungs by as much as 30%. A lady in full public dress was locked into a permanent state of shallow breathing, her posture held in a frozen, artificial alignment that made sudden movements or deep relaxation physically impossible. This physical constraint was entirely intentional. It served as a visible, material proof of her moral discipline and class standing, demonstrating that she was a creature of absolute self-regulation who had no need for manual labour or physical exertion. The breakthrough that disrupted this sartorial captivity occurred in the late 1870s, driven entirely by the unique spatial sovereignty of the afternoon tea hour. Within the secure, female-dominated territory of the drawing room, women began to reject the exhausting performative masks of public life, demanding a garment that allowed their bodies to breathe and rest. The response was the creation of the tea gown, a highly specialized piece of couture that represented the first true dress reform movement in modern history. Unlike the rigid morning dresses or the heavy, structured evening gowns that required the assistance of several domestic maids to fasten, the tea gown was engineered to be loose, flowing, and easily slipped on without a servant-s aid. It was constructed to be worn completely over an unlaced or entirely absent corset, allowing the female form to return to its natural biological dimensions for a few precious hours. The design language of the tea gown was heavily influenced by the global trade networks that supplied the tea itself, drawing inspiration from the artistic drapery of classical antiquity and the fluid elegance of the Japanese kimono, crafted from the softest, most luxurious textile available, such as heavy crepe de chine, delicate fluid silks, and cascading layers of Venetian lace. The gown was designed to float loosely around the body, pooling elegantly across the thick wool carpets as the wearer moved. It utilized interior drawstrings and unstructured sashes, rather than rigid hooks and eyes, creating a silhouette that was softly defined, yet completely unconstrained. The aesthetic movement championed this garment as the ultimate expression of artistic beauty, celebrating the natural lines of the human body over the distorted, artificial shapes created by industrial corsetry. If you find a sense of deep, comforting rest in uncovering these forgotten currents of human liberation, letting the quiet layers of historical fashion soothe your mind after a long day, taking a moment to align yourself with our narrative helps sustain this tranquil archive. Your gentle subscription to Whispers of Centuries, or your quiet return to our library of bedtime stories night after night, ensures that this dark sanctuary remains an open haven for all who seek to escape the frantic rhythms of the modern world. The physiological impact of the tea gown on the afternoon tea room completely altered the nature of human communications within the space. The sudden, complete liberation of the lungs and the diaphragm allowed for a dramatic shift in vocal tone and conversational density. In the public sphere or the formal dining room, the restriction of the corset forced women to speak in a high, strained, and highly controlled register. But within the uncorseted sanctuary of the tea hour, wrapped in the loose velvet and silk of their tea gowns, voices dropped to their lowest, most natural acoustic tones. The physical relaxation of the body invited a parallel relaxation of the intellect. Conversations became more fluid, spontaneous, and analytical, transforming the room into a vibrant incubator for advanced literary criticism, artistic debate, and covert political strategizing. Furthermore, the tea gown served as a sophisticated subversion of the traditional male gaze. Because men were only permitted into the drawing room at 4 o'clock as guests under female sovereignty, the garment was not designed to flatter masculine preferences or conform to patriarchal standards of high fashion. Instead, women wore these loose artistic gowns entirely for themselves and for each other, creating a shared aesthetic community based on mutual physical comfort and intellectual equality. It was a space where the currency of attraction was replaced by the currency of artistic expression and bodily autonomy. Yet, the radical freedom of the tea gown was governed by a strict, unyielding law of domestic geography. It was a garment that existed entirely within a temporary chronological and spatial microclimate. Because it was worn without a corset, The tea gown was viewed by Victorian moralists as deeply intimate, bordering on the scandalous. It was an absolute secret of the private interior to wear a tea gown out onto the public street or to enter the formal dining room downstairs for dinner without returning. 2. The heavy bondage of the corset was a catastrophic moral transgression that would instantly result in total social ostracism. The gown was a beautiful paradox, a symbol of absolute liberation that remained strictly imprisoned within the walls of the home. It represented a localized temporary mutiny against the rigid discipline of the empire, a quiet velvet-lined revolution that occurred every afternoon at 4 o'clock, proving that the journey toward human freedom was being fought not just on the fields of politics, but within the very seams of the clothes women wore. Bang 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 part hi mi hi bang bang bang. The global migration of the afternoon tea ritual during the late 19th century marks its transformation from a domestic luxury into a powerful instrument of imperial discipline. As the borders of the British Empire expanded to encompass nearly a quarter of the world's landmass, the 4 o'clock ritual was packed into the heavy wooden cargo trunks of military officers, colonial administrators, and their families. It travelled across vast oceans to the humid coastlines of Malaya, the high plains of East Africa, and the dense, bustling urban centres of Hong Kong. In these remote and frequently hostile environments, the afternoon tea ritual shed its identity as a mere social gathering, evolving instead into a vital psychological fortress designed to combat the profound threat of colonial displacement. For the British settlers living scattered across the vast expanses of the British Raj in India, the daily reality was defined by an overwhelming sensory and environmental alienation. The blinding, merciless tropical sun, the suffocating subcontinental humidity, and the relentless, chaotic noise of unfamiliar landscapes created a permanent state of nervous exhaustion and psychological vulnerability. The ruling class lived in constant fear of what they termed going native, a perceived moral and cultural degeneration caused by long-term exposure to foreign climates and customs. To survive this existential threat, the colonial elite weaponized the domestic habits of the home country, establishing a rigid, unyielding daily schedule that replicated the exact rhythms of a London townhouse. This desperate requirement for cultural preservation led to the structural development of the hill station. Mountain sanctuaries such as Simla, Darjeeling and Uttarakhand, perched high upon the misty, pine-scented ridges of the Himalayas and the Nilgiri Hills, thousands of feet above the baking, dust-choked plains below, the British engineered complete, microscopic illusions of rural England. They constructed sprawling stone bungalows with mock Tudor timbering, planted extensive lawns filled Vikepitehat, imported English rosebushes and damp clover, and erected parish churches whose bells chimed the hours across the mountain valleys. So, within these artificial landscapes, the afternoon tea hour served as the absolute anchor of the social calendar, a daily boundary line that separated the chaotic reality of the empire from the pristine memory of the motherland. If you find deep tranquility in travelling along these distant misty corridors of our shared past, allowing the slow, rhythmic cadence of history to dissolve the stresses of your modern day, taking a short moment to connect with our narrative helps sustain this quiet space. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or returning to our library of historical tapestries night after night ensures that this dark sanctuary remains a reliable haven for your mind to rest as wind and fade into a deep, restorative sleep. At precisely 4 o'clock every afternoon, regardless of monsoon rains or political unrest, the verandas of these mountain bungalows transformed into formal theatres of British identity. White linen tablecloths, starched to an impossible stiffness, were secured against the mountain breeze. Vecepite hat heavy silver weights. Upon these tables sat the familiar material artifacts of high society, heavy silver teapots engraved with family crests, delicate bone china cups that had miraculously survived the treacherous sea voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, and tiered stands holding miniature cucumber sandwiches made with imported wheat flour. The physical performance was executed with a fierce, almost religious devotion to the rules of Mayfair etiquette. Ladies wore elaborate, flowing lace gowns despite the remote setting, and gentlemen sat in heavy wool coats, adjusting their neckties in the tropical air. This meticulous adherence to the choreography of the tea table was a deliberate display of imperial authority and self-regulation. The ritual was heavily dependent on the silent labour of indigenous domestic servants, who were dressed in immaculate white tunics, scarlet sashes, and tightly wound turbans. These servants moved soundlessly across the stone floors of the veranda, operating the heavy cloth punkah fans suspended from the ceiling to create an artificial cool breeze, or pouring boiling water from heavy copper kettles into the silver teapots. The strict behavioural boundary between the silent, disenfranchised servants and the poised, whispering elite was a physical manifestation of the colonial hierarchy. By maintaining an absolute composure behind the porcelain cups, never allowing the silver to clink or the voice to rise above a measured register, the colonial rulers projected an illusion of effortless, unshakable superiority. The afternoon tea room had successfully expanded its borders, transforming from a quiet refuge for a hungry duchess into a global psychological anchor that sustained the emotional mechanisms of an entire empire, one cup of tea at a time. Bung bung bung, part Jaime bung bung bung. The geographical and cultural expansion of the afternoon tea ritual eventually created a profound semantic inversion in the modern memory, a linguistic misconception that completely flips the true class dynamics of the 19th century. In the contemporary world, the phrase high tea is frequently misused by luxury hotels and to advertise stab list. Their most expensive elite afternoon services, associating the word high with elevated social status, aristocratic prestige, and refined luxury. Yet in the rigorous socio-economic taxonomy of the Victorian era, the historical reality was exactly the opposite. The elite, aristocratic ritual conducted at 4 o'clock in the velvet-draped drawing rooms of Mayfair was never called high tea. It was known strictly as low tea or afternoon tea. The designation of low tea was derived directly from the physical architecture and furniture of the aristocratic drawing room. As we have explored in previous chapters, the spatial layout of the female sanctuary was defined by fluid, organic comfort. Guests did not sit upright at rigid, formal structures. Instead, they sank into low, deeply cushioned armchairs, elegant velvet sofas, and delicate sociables. The silver teapots, bone china cups, and tiered stands of cucumber sandwiches were placed upon low, beautifully carved mahogany tea tables or nests of tables that stood barely higher than the knees of the seated guests. The entire physical alignment of the body was close to the floor, creating an atmosphere of relaxed, intimate luxury that was structurally opposite to the vertical, linear discipline of the formal dining room downstairs. To participate in low tea was to declare that one had the leisure to recline, to converse in whispers, and to consume microscopic portions of non-nutritional food in the middle of the working day. High tea, by contrast, was a product of the Industrial Revolution working-class reality. born not of a desire for leisure, but of the absolute physical necessity for caloric restoration after an exhausting day of manual labour. The term high referred quite literally to the high, sturdy wooden kitchen tables or communal dining benches, around which working-class families gathered at the end of the day. This meal did not occur at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, an hour when factory workers, coal miners, and agricultural labourers were still bound to the relentless rhythm of the steam engine afield or the field, but later in the evening, between 6 and 8 o'clock, serving as the primary substantial meal of the day for the industrial proletariat. The material culture of high tea was defined by a rugged, unyielding practicality that discarded every aesthetic rule of the aristocratic drawing room. There were no delicate bone china cups with translucent walls that demanded a calibrated lightness of touch. Such fragile vessels would have instantly shattered under the rough, calloused hands of a docker or a textile weaver. Instead, the table was set Verkep teerhat heavy. Thick-walled earthenware mugs and sturdy ceramic teapots manufactured in the industrial potteries of Staffordshire. The tea was brewed using the cheapest, most robust black tea leaves available, which were left to steep for an extended period until the liquid turned a deep, bitter ink black. This intense strength was necessary to mask the harsh, mineral taste of urban water supplies and to provide a powerful chemical stimulant to clear the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift. If you find a sense of deep, comforting rest in stripping away these layers of historical myth, allowing the true, rhythmic textures of our shared past to soothe your mind into a state of quiet relaxation, taking a brief moment to support our channel ensures this peaceful sanctuary remains open for you every evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a gentle comment helps us continue crafting these slow, dark tapestries of historical storytelling, providing a reliable haven where the modern world can completely fade away into the soft echoes of the past. The food that accompanied high tea was the absolute antithesis of the minimalist cucumber sandwich. While the elite deliberately cut away the crusts of their bleached white bread to display economic waste, the working-class high tea table was a site of intense caloric preservation. The centerpiece was a dense, heavy loaf of unrefined brown bread, accompanied by salted butter, sharp cheeses, and whatever cold meats or leftover stews the family could afford. In coastal regions, the meal frequently featured pickled herrings, smoked kippers, or hot meat pies wrapped in thick, lard-infused pastry. This was a meal designed for physical survival, a dense arrangement of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates engineered to rebuild the muscles of the human machine before the next morning's whistle blew. The addition of sugar and milk to working-class tea served a purely functional, energetic purpose. While the aristocrat used a few drops of milk to appreciate the colour of their Assam, the industrial labourer dumped heavy spoonfuls of unrefined sugar and thick milk into their mug, transforming the bitter beverage into a hot, liquid source of cheap, immediate calories. This practice was actively encouraged by factory owners and social reformers of the temperance movement. Throughout the early decades of the century, the primary hydration for the working class had been low-quality beer and cheap gin, which frequently led to workplace accidents, domestic instability, and political unrest. By promoting high tea as the standard evening meal, the industrial system successfully replaced alcohol with a reliable, focusing stimulant. The caffeine in the strong black tea increased productivity, while the hot liquid provided a psychological comfort that made the sparse, monotonous diet of the urban slums bearable. The afternoon tea leaf had thus completed a spectacular dual manifestation, across the class landscape of the empire. In the low, quiet drawing rooms of Mayfair, it functioned as an exquisite apparatus of social gatekeeping, validation, and female diplomacy. In the high, loud kitchens of the industrial North, it operated as the vital fuel of the labour force, an economic engine disguised as a comforting evening brew that sustained the human machinery of the world's greatest industrial empire, one high table at a time. Bang 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 part high me too, bang bang bang. The turn of the 20th century brought a glittering decadent transition from the strict morning-shadowed Victorian era into the opulent landscape of the Edwardian era. This period, often romanticised as the golden afternoon of the European upper class, was characterised by an intense, final burst of luxury before the structural foundations of the old world were permanently shattered. Under King Edward Bey, the rigid moralism that had defined the 19th century softened into a culture that openly celebrated material, wealth, and public display. The defensive secrecy of the private drawing room began to expand into a grander, more theatrical public arena. It was no longer enough to exercise power within the isolated sanctuary of the home. The new Edwardian elite demanded a stage where their immense fortunes, magnificent couture, and social dominance could be witnessed and audited by the wider world. The afternoon tea ritual eagerly adapted to this new psychology, migrating out of the private domestic sphere and settling into the lavishly appointed spaces of urban commercial luxury. The architectural manifestation of this shift was the rise of the Grand Hotel, most notably exemplified by the opening of iconic London establishments like the Savoy and the Ritz. These institutions were masterfully engineered palaces of public sociology, designed to provide the ultra-wealthy with an environment that combined the security of the private estate with the exhilarating energy of public life. At the heart of these hotels was the Palm Court, a spectacular glass-domed winter garden filled with exotic tropical ferns, soaring palm trees, and classical fountains. The acoustics were meticulously calibrated. Thick wool carpets absorbed the sharp clatter of silver, while the high, vaulted glass ceilings allowed the gentle strains of a live string orchestra to drift over the crowd. Here, under the brilliant, diffused natural light, the Edwardian elite gathered at 4 o'clock to participate in a highly visible, theatrical version of the tea ritual. The tables were arranged in sweeping vistas that allowed every guest to closely observe, judge, and audit the fashion, manners, and companions of their peers. This public democratization of luxury within the grand hotels quickly gave rise to a radical cultural phenomenon that completely redefined the physical movement of the afternoon hour, the tea dance, or thé dansant. Born in Paris and rapidly adopted by the luxury hotels of London and New York, the tea dance introduced the intoxicating, syncopated rhythms of modern ragtime and the exotic movements of the Argentine tango into the polite world of afternoon consumption. The low tea tables of the Palm Court were pushed to the perimeter, exposing a highly polished, sweeping hardwood dance floor at the centre. Young women, dressed in the fluid, lighter fabrics of the early 20th century, stepped onto the floor with their partners under the fading afternoon light. This was a profound departure from the 19th century drawing room. The tea dance transformed the afternoon into a vibrant kinetic display of physical youth, grace, and modern sensuality. It allowed for an unprecedented level of unchaperoned physical proximity between the sexes during the day, where the subtle guidance of a partner-s hand on the waist replaced the rigid surveillance of the matriarch-s gaze. If you find a sense of deep, comforting rest in wandering through these sunlit, forgotten gardens of our shared history, letting the slow melodic cadence of the past wash away the accumulated tensions of your modern day. Taking a gentle moment to support our creative journey ensures this tranquil archive remains open for you every single evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a quiet word of appreciation helps us continue weaving these rich, dark tapestries of bedtime storytelling, providing you with a reliable, comforting haven where the frantic rhythms of the modern world can completely fade away into a deep, restorative sleep. Yet underneath the glittering surface of the Edwardian tea dance, the modern observer can detect the deep, tragic ironies of an entire social order dancing upon the edge of a precipice. The immense wealth that funded the orchids of the Palm Court and the endless silver teapots was entirely dependent on a fragile, highly unstable global economic architecture, as the music of the string orchestras filled the air and the elite sipped their delicate Darjeeling. The geopolitical tensions of Europe were quietly hardening into catastrophe. The young men who gracefully guided their partners across the polished floors of the Ritz in the summer of 1914 would, within a matter of months, find themselves in muddy uniforms, destined for the brutal slaughter of the Western Front. The Great War would not merely disrupt the afternoon schedule, it would completely dismantle the domestic service industry, wipe out a generation of the ruling class, and permanently shatter the illusion of aristocratic superiority. The Edwardian tea room was the final brilliant flare of a dying candle, a beautiful, decadent sanctuary of soft light and syncopated rhythm that captured the last moments of a golden afternoon before the world plunged into the dark modern century. Bang 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 perpt Jaime Lum, bang bang bang. The outbreak of the Great War in August 1914 acted as a catastrophic, irreversible line of demarcation that instantly shattered the opulent, leisurely structures of the Edwardian afternoon. Almost overnight, the elaborate, hyper-regulated social machinery of the 4 o'clock tea ritual was violently dismantled by the urgent, total mobilization of the entire British Empire. The first and most profound systemic shock occurred within the hidden subterranean world of domestic service, the very engine that had sustained the flawless illusion of aristocratic ease for nearly a century. As the call for military enlistment swept across the nation, thousands of young footmen, under-butlers, and grooms immediately abandoned their livery and enlisted in the armed forces, trading their quiet movements across plush drawing-room carpets for the brutal, muddy reality of the Western Front. Simultaneously, the female domestic staff, the kitchen maids, scullery workers, and housemaids who had performed the exhausting, invisible labour of hauling heavy coal and boiling water up steep stone staircases, discovered an unprecedented path to financial and social independence. They left their low-paying, highly restrictive positions in aristocratic households to work in the rapidly expanding munitions factories, commercial transport networks and civil service sectors. This massive, permanent exodus of labour completely paralysed the grand townhouses of Mayfair and the sprawling country estates of the peerage. For the first time in generations, wealthy matriarchs entered their own drawing rooms only to find the hearths cold, the silver unpolished, and the tea tables bare. The rigid social hierarchy that had depended on a small army of dependent workers to maintain its pristine boundaries collapsed under the weight of total war, forcing the elite to confront the raw, unvarnished realities of physical labour as they were forced to boil their own water and manage their own domestic spaces. The material culture of the tea assembly underwent an equally radical, sobering transformation as the British government implemented strict wartime regulations. Through the Defense of Realm Act, the volatile luxury commodities that had once been locked away inside heavy mahogany caddies as symbols of immense family capital were systematically subsumed by the state for national pan distribution. By the later years of the conflict, sugar and butter rationing became an unyielding legal reality for every citizen, completely erasing the class-based displays of economic waste that had defined the Victorian tea stand. The immaculate, crustless cucumber sandwiches and delicate, cream-laden scones vanished from the afternoon table, replaced by rustic, coarse war bread and sparse, uniced pastries. To display luxury or indulge in conspicuous consumption during a time of national sacrifice was no longer viewed as a sign of high social standing. Instead, it was aggressively condemned as unpatriotic, vulgar, and morally bankrupt. The tea leaf itself was recognized by wartime administrators not as an elite luxury to be hoarded, but as a vital, non-negotiable national resource, an essential psychological stimulant required to maintain the morale and resilience of the entire civilian population on the home front. If you find a sense of deep, comforting calm in watching these great turning points of history unfold, letting the slow, rhythmic unraveling of the past soothe your mind into a state of quiet rest, taking a gentle moment to support our collective journey ensures this peaceful archive remains open for you every single evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a quiet reflection in the comments helps us continue weaving these rich, dark tapestries of historical storytelling, providing a reliable, tranquil haven where the frantic stresses of the modern world can completely fade away into a deep restorative sleep. The physical geography of the drawing room itself experienced a profound, beautiful inversion that permanently altered its historical legacy, as casualties from the front lines mounted into the hundreds of thousands. The grand country houses of the aristocracy were generously volunteered by their owners to be converted into convalescent hospitals and auxiliary medical wards. The velvet-draped acoustic sanctuaries that had for decades served as exclusive, high-stakes laboratories of social gatekeeping, validation, and female diplomacy were stripped of their fragile ornaments. The low plush sofas and delicate sociables were cleared away to make room for rows of sterile iron hospital cots, and the soft amber light of the fireplace now illuminated the pale, worn faces of shell-shocked privates and wounded infantrymen. Within these transformed spaces, the afternoon tea ritual was completely repurposed to function as an apparatus of collective healing, comfort, and deep psychological rehabilitation. The elite women of the household, wrapped no longer in the restrictive, intimate silk of tea gowns, but dressed instead in the stark, utilitarian uniforms of voluntary aid detachment nurses, stood behind the massive family silver teapots. They poured the hot, dark liquid not for visiting duchesses or prospective wealthy suitors, but for working-class soldiers who had survived the horrors of trench warfare. The fragile bone china cups, which had once been used to audit the exact manual discipline and lineage of the drinker, were held by trembling, calloused hands that had spent months gripping rifles in the mud. In this quiet shared proximity, the old behavioural barriers and rigid class distinctions of the 19th century rapidly dissolved. The afternoon tea hour had completed its final, most significant evolutionary arc, shedding its identity as a weapon of social exclusion to become a powerful, universal symbol of national solidarity, resilience, and shared humanity. The ritual had migrated from the heights of imperial privilege down into the very heart of human survival, proving that even as the old aristocratic world burned away in the fires of the 20th century, the simple comfort of the warm cup remained an unshakable anchor for the human spirit in the dark. Bang 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 part Jaime Sao, bang bang bang. The silence that settled over the grand townhouses of Mayfair and the sprawling country estates of the British peerage after the armistice of Motinchin Tam was not the peaceful and confident quiet of the Victorian era, but the hollow, echoing stillness of an irreversible collapse. The dawn of the interwar period, specifically the Roaring Twenties, witnessed a profound, systemic rebellion against the rigid social structures and temporal disciplines that had governed the 19th century. The surviving youth of the aristocracy, deeply traumatized by the catastrophic loss of an entire fields of Europe, and profoundly cynical of the hypocritical moral codes that had driven the old world into ruin, actively sought to fracture every tradition their parents held sacred. In this climate of cultural fragmentation, the 4 o'clock afternoon tea hour, once the supreme court of social validation, matrimonial gatekeeping, and covert female diplomacy, was suddenly targeted by the rising generation as an insufferable, stagnant relic of a dead past. This generational fracture manifested directly in a radical shift in the geography of time and material consumption. The primary rival that emerged to challenge the century-old sovereignty of the silver teapot was not another exotic leaf or domestic beverage, but the rapid, intoxicating allure of the American cocktail. As the Motnin Chin Jaime Gay advanced, the traditional temporal anchor of the afternoon began to slide later into the evening, more walling, transitioning away from the quiet 4 o'clock drawing room assembly, and into the fashionable, high-energy phenomenon of the late afternoon cocktail party. The spatial and physical dynamics of elite socialization flipped completely. Instead of reclining into the low, deeply cushioned velvet sofas of the female sanctuary, where conversations were conducted in hushed, double-coded whispers, the modern interwar gathering was characterized by standing crowds, the vibrant, syncopated rhythms of jazz music, and the sharp mechanical clinking of ice cubes inside silver shakers. The slow, measured performance of measurement and self-regulation was rapidly replaced by a culture of speed, visible liberation, and a deliberate cultivation of superficiality. The economic reality of the post-war world further accelerated the decline of the traditional low tea ritual. The implementation of astronomical wartime taxes, coupled with the introduction of devastating death duties, inheritance taxes that demanded up to 40% of an estate's total value upon the passing of a peer, instantly paralyzed the financial foundations of the ruling class. Dozens of ancient noble families found themselves utterly cash poor, forced to sell off their historic libraries, auction their ancestral paintings, and dismantle the grand estates that had stood for centuries. In this climate of financial survival, the immense domestic machinery required to support the traditional afternoon tea hour was simply no longer sustainable. There were no longer armies of cheap, dependent domestic servants living in subterranean basements to polish the massive silver kettles, starch the linen tablecloths to an impossible stiffness, or spend hours preparing microscopic cucumber sandwiches without their crusts. The locked mahogany tea caddy, once a secure family treasury guarding a volatile luxury commodity, stood open and empty, its historical function as a symbol of elite economic capital completely neutralized by the democratization of global trade and the mass production of inexpensive commercial tea bags. If you find a sense of deep, comforting rest in wandering through these transitional corridors of our shared past, letting the slow analytical weight of history smooth away the accumulated tensions of your modern day. Taking a gentle moment to support our creative journey ensures this quiet archive remains open for you every single evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a soft mark of appreciation in the comments helps us continue weaving these rich, dark tapestries of bedtime storytelling, providing you with a reliable, tranquil haven where the frantic rhythms of the outer world can completely fade away into a deep, restorative sleep. The transition from the afternoon tea room to the cocktail lounge mirrored a radical, permanent restructuring of female autonomy and fashion. The loose, artistic elegance of the tea gown, which had offered women a temporary, localized mutiny against the torture of the corset within the absolute privacy of the home, was completely discarded in favor of the public, aerodynamic silhouette of the flapper dress. Women, who had finally secured the formal right to vote after decades of struggle and had experienced genuine economic agency within wartime organizations, no longer required the deceptive, hidden soft power of the drawing room committee to exert leverage over the affairs of the state. They stepped boldly out of the domestic interior and into the public sphere, occupying commercial bars, smoking cigarettes through long amber holders, and engaging in rapid, unchaperoned conversations that completely bypassed the old linguistic gatekeeping of the calling card tray. The material artifacts of the tea table, the fragile bone china cups that audited the exact manual discipline of the drinker, the silver caddy spoons shaped like scalloped seashells, and the strict chronological debate between milk in first versus tea in first, were pushed to the margins of history, surviving primarily as nostalgic family heirlooms rather than active instruments of social power. The afternoon tea ritual had completed its spectacular historical arc. It had evolved from an intimate, physiological remedy for a hungry duchess into a formidable apparatus of class purity, imperial discipline, and political patronage, before finally dissolving into the democratic, fast-paced landscape of the modern 20th century. Yet, even as the grand drawing rooms faded into the mist of the past, the core psychological essence of the ritual survived, a timeless, universal truth that whenever human beings step out of the exhausting machinery of their daily lives to share a warm cup, they are claiming a vital sanctuary of personal connection, emotional calm, and enduring dignity that no changing tide of history can ever truly erase. Bang 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 hai, bang bang. The deep institutional decay of the traditional aristocratic low tea ritual during the interwar years was finalized by the arrival of an existential crisis that forced the entire British Empire into a state of total industrial mobilization. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1945 completely transformed the cultural meaning of the tea leaf, shifting it permanently from an elegant instrument of class differentiation and social gatekeeping into a vital, state-controlled weapon of psychological survival. As German bombers began to target the industrial centres and civilian populations of British cities during the Blitz, the government recognised that the collective morale of the nation was directly dependent on the unbroken supply of single warm beverage. To secure this psychological defence system, the British government took the radical, unprecedented step of nationalising the entire tea industry within days of declaring war. In a massive covert logistical operation, the Ministry of Food seized absolute control of all private tea stocks, warehouses and global supply networks. The historic commercial auctions of Mincing Lane in London, where for over 2 centuries merchant dynasties had competed fiercely for premium, single estate Darjeelings and rare Chinese green leaves were suspended by executive decree to protect the nation's primary emotional reserve from catastrophic destruction by air raids. The government physically decentralized the storage of the leaves, moving millions of pounds of tea out of the vulnerable London docks and hiding them in secret, anonymous warehouses scattered across rural Scotland, Wales, and the north of England. From that moment on, the elite classifications of tea were entirely erased. The state manufactured a singular, standardized product known simply as the national blend. A wealthy merchant or a noble peer received the exact same coarse, robust black tea leaves as an industrial factory worker or a dock labourer. In July Motnin Chin Bond Mie, strict tea rationing was officially introduced, restricting every adult citizen to a uniform allocation of just 2 ounces of leaves per week. This tiny amount, rudely equivalent to 3 or 4 carefully measured teaspoons, became the absolute emotional currency of the civilian home front. The domestic preparation of the beverage was forced to undergo a desperate evolution of extreme conservation. Housekeepers no longer discarded the leaves after a single brewing. Instead, the used leaves were carefully dried, hoarded and reboiled multiple times, or augmented with dried herbs to stretch the precious flavour to its absolute limit. Yet this severe material scarcity did not diminish the social power of the ritual. Instead, it elevated the shared cup into a sacred, defiant act of national solidarity. If you find a sense of deep, comforting calm in watching these great currents of human history unfold, letting the slow, rhythmic narrative of the past smooth away the accumulated tensions of your modern day, taking a gentle moment to support our creative journey ensures this tranquil archive remains open for you every single evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a quiet reflection in the comments helps us continue weaving these rich, dark tapestries of bedtime storytelling, providing you with a reliable, peaceful haven where the frantic stresses of the modern world can completely fade away into a deep, restorative sleep. The true strategic value of the national blend was demonstrated nightly amidst the smoking ruins of the Blitz. The government discovered that the absolute most effective medical and psychological treatment for civilians, pulled from collapsed buildings or for exhausted firefighters navigating the infernos of London, was not a pharmaceutical sedative, but a hot, heavily sweetened mug of strong black tea. The Women's Voluntary Services WVS organised a vast fleet of mobile canteens, converted delivery vans and small terrorsicherheit operated as an elite corps of emotional first responders. These vehicles drove directly into the targeted neighbourhoods while the air raid sirens were still wailing, providing an immediate hot anchor to reality for thousands of traumatized citizens. The simple kinetic act of wrapping trembling, dust-covered fingers around a warm earthenware mug, smelling the familiar aroma of the leaf, and consuming the cheap calories of the added sugar provided a powerful somatic shield that arrested panic and re-established a sense of human order in the middle of terrifying architectural chaos. This wartime demand for absolute speed, efficiency, and mobility in the distribution of comfort served as the primary catalyst for the final, radical material evolution of the ritual in the post-war era, the mass industrialization of the tea bag. While a primitive version of the tea bag had been accidentally invented in New York in Motinchintam by a merchant named Thomas Sullivan, who sent out samples of tea wrapped in small silk pouches, which his clients mistakenly dropped directly into boiling water. The European market had resisted the technology for all decades, viewing it as a vulgar, unpolished American shortcut that ruined the delicate sensory experience of loose-leaf brewing. But the post-war world of the late Motnin Chin Cham Bommiye and Motnin Chin Cham Namiye was defined by an entirely new domestic psychology, a culture that demanded the absolute democratization of convenience, the elimination of domestic servants, and the rapid acceleration of industrial output. British manufacturers began mass-producing heat-sealed paper bags filled with highly fractured, rapidly infusing tea dust and fannings. This tiny, utilitarian object single-handedly dismantled the entire architectural and behavioural theatre of the 19th century. Drawing room. The tea bag completely eliminated the need for specialised silver caddy spoons, fragile porcelain strainers, cut glass blending bowls, and the intense, class-based surveillance regarding the chronological order of milk in first versus tea in first. The entire performance of measurement, elegance, and self-regulation was compressed into a single instant unit of mechanical convenience that could be dropped into a common mug at any factory workbench, office desk, or modern suburban kitchen. The journey of the tea leaf was now permanently completed. It had evolved from a volatile, highly taxed colonial treasure locked away inside a matriarchess private mahogany fortress into a universal, accessible public right. A simple democratic shield of warm comfort that belonged no longer to the elite rulers of an empire, but to the enduring everyday resilience of humanity itself. Bung 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 part, Haimitam bung bung bung. The sweeping geopolitical earthquakes that redefined the global landscape in the mid-20th century brought about the final, dramatic deconstruction of the imperial infrastructure that had controlled the tea trade for nearly 2 centuries. The dawn of the post-war era was defined by the unstoppable momentum of decolonization, a historic process that systematically dismantled the vast colonial empires of Europe and returned sovereignty to the nations of the global south. For generations, the production of the luxury leaf had been entirely dependent on the absolute, centralized control exerted by British corporate monopolies over the vast agricultural territories of the Indian subcontinent and East Africa. But the year Motnin Chin Bommi Bay marked a monumental turning point, with the independence of India fracturing the British Raj and shifting the ownership of the world's most lucrative tea-producing regions, including the misty valleys of Assam and the high, terraced ridges of Darjeeling, into the hands of a newly sovereign, democratic nation. This political transformation rapidly extended across the Indian Ocean. In Motnin Chin Bommi Tam, the island colony of Ceylon achieved its independent status, eventually renaming itself Sri Lanka, though its premium export product retained the famous colonial trade name, due to its immense, unshakable value in the global marketplace. This global shift in political authority fundamentally transformed the economic internal machinery of the tea industry. For over 100 years, the immense wealth generated by the hard labour of the plantations had flowed directly and exclusively into the grand merchant houses and banking institutions of the City of London, funding the lavish lifestyles and architectural opulence of the British ruling class. Under the new paradigm of national sovereignty, these newly independent governments sought to reclaim their native natural resources and rectify the historical economic imbalances of the colonial era. The ownership and administrative management of the sprawling emerald tea estates were slowly, systematically transferred from British colonial administrators to local agricultural experts, national cooperatives, and native enterprises. The grand colonial bungalows, where foreign plantation managers had once sat on shaded verandas enforcing rigid social and racial hierarchies over their afternoon cups of low tea were repurposed as modern administrative centres for state-led economic development and agricultural reform. Furthermore, the historic labour force, the millions of indigenous tea pluckers, whose ancestors had often been brought to the estates under deeply exploitative systems of indentured servitude, gradually began to secure hard-won labour rights, regulated wages, and social protections, transforming the production of the leaf from a symbol of colonial subjugation into an engine of national pride and economic independence. If you find a deep sense of comforting stillness in exploring these sweeping, transformative chapters of our shared global past, allowing the slow, rhythmic cadence of history to untangle the accumulated stresses of your modern day, taking a quiet moment to support our narrative space ensures this peaceful archive remains open for you every single evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries, or leaving a gentle thought in the comments, helps us continue building this soft, dark haven of storytelling, providing you with a reliable, tranquil sanctuary where the chaotic energies of the world can completely fade away into a deep, restorative sleep. Simultaneously, back within the domestic landscapes of the post-war West, the afternoon tea ritual completed its final migration, settling permanently away from the grand, fading aristocratic drawing rooms and into the quiet, cosy spaces of the mid-century suburban kitchen. The physical and architectural theatre of the ritual had transformed completely to reflect the egalitarian spirit of the post-war world. The heavy silver kettle carried up stone staircases by invisible servants, the custom-cast brass trivet and the locked mahogany caddy were replaced by the bright, cheerful utility of the whistling aluminum or enamel kettle resting atop a modern gas or electric stove. In the rapidly expanding suburban neighbourhoods of the Mo'in Chin Cham Nammuye and Mo'in Chin Saomuye and Mo'in Chin Saomuye, the afternoon cup of tea became the universal, democratic anchor of the nuclear family's daily routine. It was no longer an elite laboratory for social gatekeeping, class surveillance, or strategic matrimonial interviews. Instead, it evolved into a private, intimate ritual of domestic recovery and emotional comfort. The sensory environment of the tea hour shifted from the heavy, velvet-draped acoustic isolation of the Victorian mansion to the bright, clean, and functional surfaces of Formica kitchen tables, the soft, reassuring hum of the electric refrigerator, and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. The beverage was now consumed not from fragile, translucent bone china that demanded a calibrated lightness of touch, but from sturdy, mass-produced ceramic mugs and colourful earthenware pots that could easily withstand the casual, energetic rhythms of everyday family life. Iconic corporate tea brands transitioned from elite specialty boutiques straight onto the shelves of the newly emerging supermarkets, offering pre-packaged, uniform tea bags that promised a reliable, instantaneous brew for every household. This mid-century democratization did not diminish the psychological power of the leaf. Rather, it universalized its function as an emotional sanctuary accessible to all. The simple, timeless act of pausing at 4 o'clock to brew a fresh pot of tea remained a vital mechanism of self-regulation, a quiet, comforting boundary line drawn against the fast-paced, high-pressure demands of the modern industrial world. It proved that the fundamental human need for a peaceful moment of connection, rest, and personal sovereignty transcends every shift of empire, architecture, and time, remaining an unshakable anchor for the human spirit as the centuries quietly unfold into the dark. Bung 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 pert hai chin, bung bung bung. The late 20th century, particularly the transition through the Bonin Tammagay and into the Mo'in Chin Tammagay introduced a radical era of unprecedented technological speed, global hyper-efficiency and digital acceleration, the rapid expansion of the personal computing revolution, the birth of the internet, and the intense 24-hour cycle of global financial markets demanded a parallel acceleration of human physiology and daily life. In this frantic, high-pressure landscape, the traditional slow-paced afternoon tea ritual experienced a brief, quiet eclipse within the urban centers of the West. The modern corporate boardrooms, glass-fronted skyscrapers, and frantic creative offices completely discarded the ceramic teapots and the mandatory temporal pauses of the mid-century, replacing them with the harsh chemical stimulants of instant coffee, commercial espresso machines, and the aggressive rush of carbonated energy drinks. Time itself was redefined as the ultimate volatile commodity to be exploited at maximum speed, and any cultural practice that demanded a complete suspension of productivity for 20 minutes at 4 o'clock was widely dismissed by the modern workforce as an inefficient, obsolete luxury of a slower, dead world. However, this extreme acceleration of the daily human experience eventually generated a profound, systemic psychological and cultural counter-reaction. As the century drew to a close and slipped into the dawn of the 21st century, humanity began to experience the deep, exhausting symptoms of chronic technological burnout, digital fragmentation, and the total erosion of absolute quiet spaces. It was within this climate of collective weariness that a remarkable, nostalgic renaissance of the traditional afternoon tea ritual began to take root across major global capitals, the grand luxury hotels of London, New York, Tokyo, and Paris, reclaiming their historic role as elite stages of cultural choreography, spearheaded a magnificent, multi-million-dollar revival of the classic afternoon tea assembly. But this modern resurgence carried a completely new semantic and psychological meaning. The ritual was no longer performed as a mandatory mechanism of aristocratic class gatekeeping or ancestral validation. Instead, it was brilliantly repurposed as an intentional sanctuary of disconnect, an oasis of tactile reality, sensory indulgence, and slow, deliberate consumption, explicitly designed to counteract the overwhelming, weightless rush of the digital age. If you find a deep sense of comforting rest in watching the frantic modern world slow its pace, allowing the rich, rhythmic textures of our shared past to soothe your mind into a state of quiet tranquility, taking a gentle moment to support our narrative journey ensures this peaceful archive remains open for you every single evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a quiet reflection in the comments helps us continue weaving these slow, dark tapestries of bedtime storytelling, providing you with a reliable or comforting haven where the modern world can completely fade away into a deep restorative sleep. The material culture of this late century tea revival adapted to serve this new psychological function, seamlessly blending historic elegance with a highly curated contemporary aesthetic. The tables of the modern palm courts and high-end boutique tea rooms were meticulously arranged to celebrate the physical artisanal texture of real-world objects. Guests were presented once again with the exquisite heavy weight of polished silver teapots, the delicate translucency of fine bone china, and the visual geometric arrangement of the three-tiered stand. The culinary menu experienced a sophisticated gastronomic elevation. The classic cucumber sandwich was reimagined by world-class pastry chefs, who infused the humble vegetable with rare artisanal vinegars and served it on house-baked brioche while the scones were paired with organic, small batch preserves, and genuine clotted cream imported directly from traditional Devonshire farms. This was no longer merely a light meal, it was a highly produced, multi-sensory performance of the slow living movement, a deliberate deceleration where the contemporary guest paid premium prices not for the physical nutrition of the food, but for the absolute luxury of unhurried time, sensory quiet and uninterrupted presence. The behavioural rules of the modern afternoon tea room evolved to enforce this psychological sanctuary through a strict, unspoken code of digital etiquette in a profound, beautiful inversion of the 19th century calling card tray, which had historically functioned to filter out undesirable family lineages. The modern gatekeeping mechanism of the tea room was directed squarely against the digital intrusion itself. Guests entering these velvet-clad spaces were expected to silence their smartphones, slide them out of sight into bags or jacket pockets, and completely banish the persistent, anxious glow of notifications from the table. The conversation shifted away from the frantic, fragmented cadence of online feeds, settling back into the continuous, fluid, and deep registers of the human voice. To sit at the low tea table in the early 21st century was to engage in an act of peaceful, elegant resistance against the hyper-connected machine of modern life. It was a beautiful reclamation of personal sovereignty, proving that the ancient, quiet wisdom of the warm cup remains an unshakable anchor for the human mind, shielding the inner self from the chaos of the outer world as history flows onward into the unknown. Bang 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 part bamui, bang bang bang. The long historical evolution of the afternoon tea ritual, from its origin as a quiet physiological remedy in a Duchess' private chamber to a global apparatus of imperial power, and finally to a modern sanctuary of digital disconnect, reveals a deeper universal truth. The ritual is fundamentally an architecture of absolute stillness. It is a deliberate, highly sophisticated manipulation of human perception and time. In the modern world, time is typically experienced as a relentless linear acceleration, an unyielding sequence of deadlines, digital alerts, and economic demands that force the human mind into a state of permanent anticipation and cognitive fragmentation. But the moment the silver kettle is lifted and the hot liquid meets the leaf, the linear progression of the outer world is abruptly suspended, replaced by the cyclical, rhythmic time of the tea room. This intentional deceleration operates on a profound somatic level, systematically recalibrating the nervous system through a series of predictable physical transitions. The journey into stillness begins with the visual and tactile transition from motion to rest. As a person sits before the tea table, their physical posture is immediately altered by the architecture of the furniture. One does not stand or row a hat while managing a fragile bone china cup. The material fragility of the vessel forces the body to assume a state of quiet composure and deliberate alignment. The hands, which spend the day tapping frantically on weightless glass screens or navigating chaotic environments, are suddenly required to calibrate their muscles to lift a single, elegant object with an exquisite lightness of touch. This mechanical focus acts as a powerful cognitive anchor, pulling the wall's awareness of the mind away from the anxieties of the past and the uncertainties of the future, grounding it completely within the immediate, tactile reality of the present moment. The sensory landscape of the tea hour further deepens this psychological shelter, using the natural chemistry of the plant and the soft acoustics of the space to quiet the inner self. The rising steam from the teapot carries a complex bouquet of volatile aromatic compounds that directly interface verkepite hat, the olfactory system, triggering immediate signals of safety, warmth, and domestic comfort within the deeper recesses of the brain. As the tea steeps during those mandatory minutes of absolute conversational suspension, the shared silence of the room becomes a dense, restorative medium. It is a creative pause where nothing is required, no productivity is measured, and no performance is audited. The simple act of waiting for the dark leaves to unfurl becomes a form of meditation, a patient surrender to a natural process that cannot be accelerated by industrial machinery or digital commands. If you find a sense of deep, comforting tranquility in tracing these quiet philosophies of our shared past, letting the slow, rhythmic cadence of history smooth away the accumulated tensions of your modern day, taking a gentle moment to support our creative journey ensures this peaceful archive remains open for you every single evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a soft mark of appreciation in the comments helps us continue weaving these rich, dark tapestries of bedtime storytelling, providing you with a reliable, tranquil haven where the frantic stresses of the outer world can completely fade away into a deep, restorative sleep. When the tea is finally poured, the chemical composition of the Camellia sinensis leaf works in perfect harmony with the somatic architecture of the ritual to induce a unique state of relaxed alertness. Unlike the rapid, jagged spike of adrenaline and subsequent crash associated with the consumption of heavy coffee or synthetic energy drinks, tea delivers its caffeine in a beautifully regulated, sustained release. This is driven by the presence of L-theanine, a unique amino acid that actively crosses the blood-brain barrier to stimulate the production of alpha brainwaves, which are directly associated with deep relaxation, mental clarity, and creative focus. The combination of caffeine and L-theanine creates a psychological state that philosophers have long celebrated as alert tranquility, a serene, unshakable center where the mind remains perfectly sharp and observant, yet completely free from the frantic, underlying currents of nervous agitation. The afternoon tea table, therefore, survives across the centuries, not merely as a relic of aristocratic vanity or an obsolete cultural habit, but as an essential timeless technology of human well-being. It is a universal democratic boundary line drawn against the chaos of the outer world, a physical declaration that every human being possesses an inherent right to step out of the exhausting machinery of survival, claim a vital pocket of personal sovereignty, and restore their spirit within a space of soft light, quiet acoustics, and shared connection. As the cup is lowered back onto its saucer with a faint, soft click, the performance of stillness is completed. The mind has been recalibrated, the body has been comforted, and the inner self has been safely fortified, proving that no matter how rapidly the tides of history may shift, the simple, ancient wisdom of the warm cup will always remain an enduring anchor for the human soul in the dark. Bang 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 parpt, bami mort bang bang bang. The deep human craving for structured stillness and spatial governance, which found its democratic expression in the late 19th century afternoon tea room, traces its ancestral lineage back to the most complex, hyper-regulated domestic environments in human history, the royal courts of early modern Europe. To fully comprehend the hidden mechanics of historical daily life, one must step away from the public battlefields and legislative chambers, and enter the absolute center of dynastic authority, the monarch's private bedchamber, in the vast gilded landscape of the Palace of Versailles under the Bourbon dynasty, culminating in the tragic, highly disciplined reign of Louis XVI. The simple biological necessity of sleep was completely stripped of its private, instinctive nature. Instead, the nocturnal hours were engineered as a supreme, highly theatrical apparatus of state governance, political patronage, and psychological control. At the absolute core of this nocturnal system was the ritual known as the kucha, the formal multi-tiered public bedding ceremony of the king. While a modern individual views the transition to sleep as an act of absolute withdrawal from society into the sanctuary, isolation, the Bourbon monarchs understood that their physical bodies were the literal property of the state. Every movement made by the royal body, from the first blink of morning light to the final closing of the eyes at night, was a public transaction. The coucher was designed specifically to transform the vulnerable, somatic descent into unconsciousness, into a rigorous display of absolute political hierarchy, where the distribution of royal favour was measured by a courtier's physical proximity to the royal linens. The ritual commenced precisely at 11 o'clock each evening, signalled across the vast, echoing corridors of the palace by the quiet rhythmic tapping of the Swiss guards, halberds against the marble floors. As the public salons were cleared and the massive candle chandeliers were slowly extinguished, an elite, meticulously vetted group of courtiers gathered outside the heavy gold-leafed doors of the king's state bedchamber. Entry into this sacred interior was governed by a strict taxonomy of access, divided into distinct waves known as entrees. The highest-ranking princes of the blood, dukes, and great officers of the crown were permitted into the room first, creating a dense, whispering human wall around the massive velvet canopied state bed. To be granted a seat on a low velvet stool, or simply to be allowed to stand within the third row of onlookers, was a profound economic and social asset. It was a material declaration of social validation that could instantly secure a royal pension, a military command, or a lucrative marriage alliance for a courtier's family. The physical choreography of the coucher was executed with the cold, rhythmic precision of a religious liturgy. The king would take his place at the centre of the room, surrounded by his personal valets and physicians, who closely monitored his physical health as a matter of state security. The most fiercely contested, politically volatile moment of the entire evening was the distribution of the bougeoir, the small silver-handled wax candlestick used to illuminate the king's immediate path to his bed. The honour of holding this small flame was not determined by merit or affection, but by a shifting matrix of dynamic royal favour. Each night, the king would silently scan the crowd of waiting courtiers, choose a single individual, and hand them the candlestick. For those few minutes, the chosen courtier stood in the literal and figurative light of majesty, a public signal to the entire court that their influence was supreme. If you find a sense of deep, comforting calm in watching these intricate, forgotten theatres of the past fade into the shadows of time, letting the slow, rhythmic cadence of history smooth away the accumulated tensions of your modern day, taking a gentle moment to support our creative journey ensures this peaceful archive remains open for you every single evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a quiet reflection in the comments helps us continue weaving these rich, dark tapestries of bedtime storytelling, providing you with a reliable, tranquil haven where the frantic stresses of the modern world can completely fade away into a deep, restorative sleep. As the garments of the day were systematically removed by the highest-ranking nobles present, a duke holding the right sleeve of the royal shirt, a prince managing the left, the physical environment of the bedchamber adjusted to enforce the transition toward rest. The lighting of the room was deliberately managed to alter human perception. The brilliant, blinding glare of hundreds of pure beeswax candles was slowly reduced to the soft, flickering amber glow of a single night lamp resting inside a polished silver basin. The acoustics of the palace shifted dramatically. The loud, vibrant chatter of the day's political scheming dropped to a low rhythmic murmur of whispers, mirroring the natural deceleration of the monarch's own pulse. The architecture of the royal bed itself was an extraordinary monument to dynastic continuity and spatial defence. It was raised upon a high wooden platform separated from the rest of the room by a heavy, gilded balustrade that functioned as a legal and physical boundary line. No courtier, regardless of their lineage, was ever permitted to step past this balustrade without explicit royal command. To touch the royal bed linens without authorization was viewed as a severe violation of majesty. The bed was enclosed by massive, cascading curtains of heavy silk brocade, lined with thick layers of gold embroidery, designed to muffle the distant, echoing sounds of the vast palace and trap the warm air against the chill of the unheated stone walls. Once the king had finally reclined beneath the heavy covers, the final wave of courtiers bowed deeply and backed out of the room in absolute silence, the heavy mahogany doors clicking shut behind them. Yet even as the doors closed, the illusion of absolute privacy remained entirely absent. The king was never truly alone. Throughout the night, the first valet de chambre slept on a small, folding cot placed directly across the threshold of the royal door, his body serving as a literal physical shield against any unauthorized intrusion. Outside in the dim corridors, patrols of guards moved soundlessly in felt-soled shoes, maintaining a vigilant, 24-hour watch over the sovereign's safety. The royal bedtime ritual had successfully transformed the most vulnerable biological necessity of life into a formidable monument of absolute statecraft, proving that within the high-stakes world of the ancient regime, the mechanics of sleep were inextricably bound to the preservation of the empire itself, one quiet breath at a time. Bang bang bang, part barmy high bang, bang bang. The deep, not silent stillness that wrapped the gilded chambers of Versailles during that nocturnal hours began to dissolve not vercepite, hat, the natural, gradual arrival of dawn over the horizon, but with a highly orchestrated, mechanical sequence of domestic awakenings, long before the first rays of the sun could pierce the thick, heavy mist rising from the palace gardens and fountains. The subterranean world beneath the royal apartments was already vibrating with intense, calculated activity. In the vast kitchens, cellars, and wood yards, hundreds of domestic servants moved soundlessly in the dark, lighting massive brick ovens, preparing delicate morning broths, and carrying heavy bundles of seasoned oak logs up the narrow, hidden stone staircases to replenish the dying embers of the palace fireplaces. The morning transition of the monarch from the vulnerable sanctuary of sleep back into the absolute light of state. Governance was known as the lever, a ritual even more rigorous, politically volatile, and meticulously staged than the evening bedding ceremony. The precise operational clock of the royal awakening was governed entirely by the king's first valet de chambre, who slept on his small folding cot directly across the threshold of the royal door. At precisely 7:30 or 8 o'clock each morning, depending on the rigid seasonal schedule established by dynastic tradition, the first valet would quietly rise from his bed, adjust his clothing in the dim light, and step softly past the heavy gilded balustrade toward the royal bed. He did not call out or make any sudden jarring movements that might fracture the sovereign's remaining rest. Instead, he approached with an exquisite, practiced noiselessness, gently drawing back a single layer of the heavy silk velvet curtains that enclosed the bed. This initial subtle introduction of light was the official signal that the royal day had begun. The valet would then bow deeply and utter a single unvarying phrase in a low measured register, "Sire, it is the hour." Instantly, the heavy mahogany doors of the bedchamber would click open to admit the highly restricted wave of individuals, the royal physicians and surgeons. Long before any politician, prince, or foreign ambassador could catch a glimpse of the monarch, the state demanded an absolute comprehensive audit of the royal biology. The premier medici head physician and the premier chirurgian head surgeon would approach the raised platform of the bed, bowing with profound gravity. They would gently take the king's wrist to monitor the steady rhythmic pulse, carefully examine the clarity of his eyes, and interrogate him in soft whispers regarding the absolute quality of his night's rest. In the medical philosophy of the 17th and 18th centuries, the physical health of the king was not a private matter. It was the literal health of the state itself. A restless night, a sudden fever, or an imbalance of the bodily humours was viewed as a profound systemic crisis that could destabilise financial markets, paralyse military campaigns, or alter the delicate balance of international treaties. Only after the physicians were completely satisfied and had declared the royal vitality pristine could the political machinery of the palace proceed to the next stage. If you find a sense of deep, comforting tranquility in watching these intricate, forgotten daily theatres of the past unfold, letting the slow, analytical weight of history smooth away the accumulated tensions of your modern day, taking a gentle moment to support our creative journey, ensures this peaceful archive remains open for you every single evening. Because subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a quiet reflection in the comments helps us continue weaving these rich, dark tapestries of bedtime storytelling, providing you with a reliable, tranquil haven where the frantic stresses of the modern world can completely fade away into a deep, restorative sleep. Once the medical inspection was concluded, the bedchamber was prepared for the petit lever, the small elite morning assembly that represented the absolute pinnacle of courtly ambition. The heavy window shutters were thrown open by the valets, allowing the sharp, clear morning light to flood across the polished parquet floors, illuminating the magnificent gold leaf decorations and grand ceiling frescoes. A small, select group of individuals, composed of the king's immediate family, the princes of the blood, and the great officers of the royal household, was permitted to enter the room, creating a quiet, expectant circle behind the gilded balustrade. The physical act of rising from the bed and dressing the royal form was transformed into a complex ladder of political patronage. Every garment, from the finest linen underwear to the heavy silk stockings, was handled as if it were a sacred relic. The Grand Master of the Wardrobe would step forward, holding the king's morning gown, while another high-ranking duke was granted the immense, fiercely contested privilege of presenting the royal shirt. To the modern observer, these tasks might appear menial, even humiliating, but in the hyper-vigilant ecosystem of Versailles, they were weapons of supreme leverage. To be the individual who handed the king his right sleeve meant possessing a direct, unmonitored line of physical proximity to the source of all wealth and power. In those few brief moments, a courtier could whisper a private request, present a personal petition, or secure a crucial favour before the king was surrounded by the wider, chaotic crowds of the public salons. As the king washed his hands with spirits of wine from a chaste silver basin and knelt on a velvet cushion to perform his morning prayers, the room filled with the low, rhythmic murmur of whispers. The architecture of the space with its high ceilings and heavy draperies, beautifully dampened the acoustics, ensuring that the intense political plotting occurred in a state of soft, controlled quiet. The petit lever would slowly transition into the grand lever, where dozens of lesser nobles, artists, and foreign dignitaries were finally allowed to enter, filling the room to its absolute capacity to witness the final adjustments of the royal attire. The king would step forward, fully dressed, perfumed, and immaculate. No longer a vulnerable mortal who had emerged from the shadows of sleep, but a living monument of absolute state authority, the Sun King, ready to radiate power over his empire, proving that within the high-stakes world of the ancient regime, the transition from darkness to light was the ultimate performance of dynastic survival. Bang 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 part bammy bow bang bang bang. The extraordinary material and behavioural choreography of the French royal court, which reached its absolute theatrical peak in the daily rituals of the lever and the couture, was destined to face a sudden, violent confrontation with the unstoppable forces of historical change. The year Mot Bay Tamshin marked a catastrophic rupture that shattered the golden cage of Versailles forever as the flames of the French Revolution swept across the nation. The heavy gilded balustrades that had for generations served as sacred boundaries of dynastic sovereignty were torn down, the massive velvet canopied state beds were looted, and the absolute power of the Bourbon monarchy was abruptly dismantled. The historic collapse of the Ancien Regime proved that, while the physical architectures of gold leaf, marble, and silk could be completely destroyed by the tides of political upheaval, the underlying human psychological need for structured transitions did not die. It merely underwent a profound, centuries-long process of democratization, descending out of the exclusive palaces of kings and spreading quietly into the everyday lives of ordinary humanity. As the Western world transitioned out of the early modern era and plunged into the relentless machinery of the industrial 19th and 20th centuries, the nature of human time was fundamentally restructured. The steady, organic rhythm of the sun, which the Sun King had so masterfully subverted to mimic his own daily movements, was permanently replaced by the mechanical, unyielding authority of the industrial clock and the factory whistle. In this fast-paced, high-pressure modern landscape, the elite theatres of self-regulation and spatial defence did not vanish. Instead, they found a magnificent, sophisticated reinvention within the private domestic sanctuary of the afternoon tea room. The Victorian Duchess, sitting behind her silver teapot, managing the complex linguistic codes of the calling card tray, was navigating the exact same psychological territory as the valet de chambre drawing back the curtains of Versailles. Both systems utilized the meticulous arrangement of physical objects, whether a fragile bone china cup or a silver-handled wax candlestick, to build a temporary fortress of emotional calm, class validation, and personal sovereignty against the chaotic, unpredictable currents of the outer world. If you find a sense of deep, comforting rest in watching the grand structures of human history transform, letting the slow, analytical weight of the past smooth away the accumulated tensions of your modern day, taking a gentle moment to support our creative journey ensures this peaceful archive remains open for you every single evening. Subscribing to Whispers of Centuries or leaving a quiet reflection in the comments helps us continue weaving these rich, dark tapestries of bedtime storytelling, providing you with a reliable, tranquil haven where the frantic stresses of the modern world can completely fade away into a deep, restorative sleep. The grand historical synthesis of these daily rituals reveals that human beings are, At their absolute core, architects of stillness. Across every century, every civilization, and every socio-economic boundary, we find an unbroken, universal impulse to frame the passage of day and night with meaningful, repetitive choreography. We do not exist merely to endure the chaotic, boundless rush of survival. We possess an inherent, spiritual need to tame time, to divide it into predictable, safe, and beautiful increments. The strict chronological debate between milk in first versus tea in first. In a working-class industrial kitchen, the delicate kinetic harmony required to balance an expensive porcelain saucer in a Mayfair drawing room, and the silent, hyper-vigilant medical audit conducted around a royal bed at dawn are all manifestations of the exact same human desire. They are practical, material shields engineered by the human mind to preserve internal order, cultivate emotional dignity, and claim an unshakable center of peace, proving that the true history of our species is written not just in the grand declarations of empires, but within the quiet, sacred habits of our daily lives. Bung 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 part, but do bung bung. The long, intricate journey through the velvet shadows of our shared past now brings us to the final, absolute threshold of our narrative, where the grand theatres of global empires, royal palaces, and elite drawing rooms slowly dissolve, leaving only the quiet, immediate reality of this present moment. We have watched the afternoon tea leaf migrate across vast oceans, transforming from a volatile, highly taxed colonial treasure into a formidable machine of dynastic survival, wartime resilience, and modern digital resistance. We have entered the gilded bedchambers of absolute monarchs, witnessing how the vulnerable biological necessity of rest was weaponized as a supreme monument of statecraft. Yet, as we step away from the echoing corridors of history and allow the faded tapestries of the past to settle into the darkness, we uncover the ultimate beautiful truth that binds all these disparate worlds together. Every historical era, every architecture of power, and every ritual of self-regulation we have explored was engineered to serve the exact same human heart that beats within you right now. The ancient kings, the Victorian matriarchs, the wartime emergency workers, and the modern suburban families were all searching for the same elusive sanctuary, a reliable haven of emotional calm, somatic safety, and uninterrupted presence. Tonight, as the modern world outside your window slows its frantic pace, and the persistent, anxious glow of digital notifications finally fades away into the dark, you are invited to claim your own sovereign right to absolute stillness. Your bedroom is no longer a passive space. It has transformed into your private, secure drawing room, a velvet-lined chamber of personal recovery where the heavy demands of productivity are completely suspended. The slow, rhythmic cadence of this narrative has been a deliberate choreography designed to mirror the natural deceleration of your own biology. Just as the valets of Versailles slowly extinguished the grand wax chandeliers and lowered their voices to a low, soothing murmur of whispers to prepare the sovereign for rest, the tensions and burdens of your day have been systematically dismantled. Piece by piece, your breathing has settled into a deep, continuous and peaceful register, working in perfect harmony with the silent acoustics of your room to induce a state of complete, unshakable tranquility. There are no more performances to audit, no more social codes to navigate, and no more external forces to satisfy. You have successfully drawn an unyielding boundary line against the chaos of the outer world, entering a sacred space where nothing is required of you but the absolute surrender to rest. The performance of stillness is now complete. The fragile vessels of history have been safely laid aside, The silver kettles have grown cold, and the gold-leaf doors of the past have clicked shut in absolute silence. As you sink deeper into the soft, comforting embrace of your bed, allowing your mind to drift away from the waking world, you are entering the ultimate, democratic coucher, the final, most significant ritual of human freedom. Sleep is the great historical equalizer, a timeless dark ocean where all the hierarchies of empires, wealth, and time are completely dissolved into a state of pure, restorative peace. Let the soft echoes of the centuries wash over you like a gentle tide, carrying your awareness down into the deep, healing shadows of a dreamless slumber. The sanctuary is open, the fortress is secure, and your spirit is safe. Rest now, completely and deeply, as the quiet world fades away into the timeless dark.